The man known to history as James Longstreet was born on the 8th of January, 1821 in the village of Edgefield, South Carolina. James's father, James Longstreet Sr., was of Dutch ancestry, his forefathers having settled in the colony of New Netherlands, which in the late 17th century became the English colony of New York. James was the fifth child of James and Mary Longstreet and their third son. Longstreet's story is entangled with the growth, development, and fracture of the United States in the second half of the 19th century. A Confederate general, Longstreet left a complicated record as a soldier, politician, and citizen that remains contested to this day. His family moved steadily southward, first to New Jersey and then, in the 1780s, to Augusta, Georgia, some 700 miles distant. The move, facilitated by the end of the American Revolution in 1783, had re-established a tentative peace in the United States. Georgia, which had been largely occupied by British forces during the American Revolution, was one of the smallest states by population and offered a seemingly bright future for adventurous spirits, particularly those willing to invest in cotton production. Cotton, a plant fiber used in the creation of textiles, was gaining increasing popularity across the globe, in part because of the increased production from plantations across the American South. Several years after the Longstreet family purchased their first plantation in Edgefield, South Carolina, some 28 miles north of Augusta, Georgia, the cotton gin was invented by Eli Whitney. This machine enabled the hardy short-staple cotton to be processed into material fit for use in textile factories at a much quicker rate than any human could process it. This invention made cotton production possible in upland regions of the American South, such as the Piedmont region of Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. When James Sr. was born, the explosion of cotton production was already sweeping the southern United States. Upon entering adulthood, James Sr. bought his own land near the Appalachian Mountains and grew cotton. Occasionally, James Sr. would come down to Augusta to visit the family. On one of these trips, he met his future wife, Mary Ann Dent. Mary Ann Dent's family was well connected, her father Thomas's cousin being the Supreme Court Justice John Marshall, who helped establish the independence of the judiciary and its prestige in American life over his tenure of 34 years. Mary Ann was a relative newcomer to Georgia. Originally from Maryland, her family had been long established there before her parents decided to seek their fortunes in the heart of Georgia. While it is unclear when exactly the two met, they were married by December of 1814. Following their marriage, Mary Ann moved with James Sr. to his plantation in the Appalachian foothills. There, she gave birth to 4 children, Anna, William, Sarah Jane, and John. Though both Sarah Jane and John died as infants, in 1820, Mary gave birth to her 5th child in South Carolina, and the couple named their new son James after his father. James grew up quickly in the Piedmont region, which was still heavily forested and wild. While slave labor had begun changing the landscape of northern Georgia, the region was still considered remote and dangerous. As a child, James hunted, fished, rode horses, and explored the woods. He spent his first 9 years with his family on the plantation before his father, James Sr., felt it was time for his son to acquire a better education than what was offered in the backwoods of Georgia. In particular, James Sr. wanted his namesake to attend the United States Military Academy at West Point in New York. Young James was perfectly agreeable to these plans and he spoke often with relatives about the glory of military service. In the autumn of 1830, as the summer harvest wound to a close, James Sr. and James Jr. traveled to Augusta to live with James Jr.'s aunt and uncle and attend the prestigious Richmond County Academy. Now, James Jr. was to be taught by his uncle Augustus and Aunt Frances. Augustus, a well-connected and politically active man, helped instill in young James a passion for states' rights, or the concept that the states of the United States had not conceded their rights when they joined in a union in the 1780s. Thus, when in 1832 and 1833 the nullification crisis gripped the nation, Augustus was one of the leading voices supporting secession. The nullification crisis was a conflict over the ability of South Carolina to nullify or ignore a national tariff law, which they believed they shouldn't have to pay. Led by John C. Calhoun, one of South Carolina's brightest political stars and a firm believer in states' rights, the dispute nearly devolved into armed conflict and civil war. When the crisis passed, many of the ideas about states' rights had been embedded in the 12-year-old James as he listened to his uncle and his friends discuss the issue. While Augusta, Georgia, paled in comparison to other American cities, it was a growing metropolis and one in which its citizens sought to be more connected to the outside world. James struggled in school, preferring the outdoors to the confines of the classroom. Still, the years of education helped him and gave him the network necessary to access West Point. James's world was rocked when, while on a trip in Augusta, James Sr. died during a local cholera outbreak. His mother soon afterwards moved the family to northern Alabama, thus creating both physical and emotional distance from her son, who remained in Georgia. As James mourned the loss of his father and his mother's move, he grew closer to his uncle and aunt. In some ways, they became surrogate parents for the young man looking to go far beyond the plantations of the South. Over the next 5 years, James continued to go to school and church, building relationships and helping on the plantation. In 1837, Augustus began working his connections. In order to enter West Point, the United States Military Academy, one had to have a nomination from a congressional official. Using his connections with a relative, Reuben Chapman, a congressman in northern Alabama where James's mother lived, James was finally able to achieve his father's dream of becoming a military officer. He left for West Point in June of 1838, arriving as a member of the class of 1842. Longstreet had little idea of how influential his years in the military academy would be on the rest of his life. James arrived at a time when the academy was becoming far more robust and prestigious than it had ever been in its history. Founded during the presidency of Thomas Jefferson in 1802, West Point had already trained dozens of officers to lead the fledgling United States military. These officers, instructed in warfare and engineering, helped advance the military and imperial visions of the young American Republic. West Point engineers helped to design roads, canals, and military installations across the United States, helping solidify the American government's control over its vast expanse of territory and allowing greater expansion of settlers across the continent. Wars and treaties had decimated Native American power in the Midwest and Southeast, leading to a rapid expansion of American power. 8 years prior to James's arrival at West Point, and only several hundred miles to the northwest, the Cherokee people, along with other southeastern tribes, had been forcibly removed from their lands and transported to Indian Territory in what is now modern-day Oklahoma, in a removal that has become known as the Trail of Tears. This new territory, conquered by the United States, opened up vast swathes of land to farming and cotton planting, further necessitating more infrastructure and giving even more opportunities to those schooled in engineering at West Point. James was never the best student, often struggling to not only pass his more academic classes of philosophy and foreign language but also to conform to a military lifestyle. He was stubborn and frequently found himself in trouble with the administration for his decisions to disobey academy rules. During his time at West Point, he was nearly always at the bottom of his class. Yet despite doing poorly on tests, he was retaining information that would be pivotal for his work as a military commander in the future. Longstreet was one of the most popular in the class and had the nickname Old Pete. He became friends with numerous future Union and Confederate leaders, but his closest friend was Ulysses S. Grant, a serious and quiet Ohioan who had doubted whether he should join the academy. For the rest of their lives, the two men remained friends. On the 1st of July, 1842, James graduated from the academy and was made a second lieutenant of the infantry. Assigned to Jefferson Barracks, Missouri, with the 4th Infantry, James spent some time in Georgia before heading on his adventure. Stationed just south of St. Louis, Missouri, Longstreet was quickly instructed in the ways of the professional army. Located on the Mississippi River, much of his next 2 years was monotonous. However, with the arrival of his friend Ulysses Grant, he began to travel to the small town of Whitehaven. There, his best friend fell in love with 17-year-old Julia Dent. Only a few months later, James met Maria Garland. Maria, or Louise as she was called by her family, was the daughter of a prominent family of Virginia immigrants. Her father, John, a military man, was stationed at Jefferson Barracks and was considered extremely pretty by the men at Jefferson Barracks. Louise soon fell for James. Though wanting to marry, they instead began a long engagement as her parents insisted that the couple wait until Louise was older. A few months later, James was sent to Louisiana, hundreds of miles to the south, as part of the Army of Observation under the command of Major General Zachary Taylor. Tensions between the United States and the Mexican Republic were at an all-time high following the annexation of Texas in December of 1845. Texas, a former province of Mexico, had been opened up to American settlement in the early 1820s in part to help provide greater strength to the poorly populated province. However, the arrival of white Americans from the South, who refused to comply with Mexico's prohibition on slavery and who began pushing for separatism, led to increased tensions with the Mexican central government. In 1835, the Mexican government sent the army under President Santa Anna to establish control. Texans, primarily American Texans but also some Tejano or Mexican Texans, launched an independence movement on the 2nd of March, 1836. Over the next decade, intermittent fighting between the Mexican and Texan governments continued as the Mexican Congress refused to accept the Texans' independence. The Texans also petitioned the United States to annex the territory. However, then-President Andrew Jackson and his successor Martin Van Buren both viewed annexation as a political liability given the strong anti-annexation faction in the United States at the time. This all changed in 1844 when James K. Polk won the election on a campaign centered on westward expansion and manifest destiny, a political philosophy which argued that Americans were destined to rule from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean because of the favor of Providence. Building on the work of his predecessor John Tyler, Polk officially annexed Texas on the 29th of December, 1845. This decision immediately spurred tensions with the Mexican government, which viewed the annexation as an unscrupulous land grab by the Americans. Polk sent representatives to try and negotiate for a land sale of much of northern Mexico. However, the Mexican government refused Polk's offers. Polk instead sent an American army under General Zachary Taylor to Texas. Edwards, Texas Longstreet was reassigned after his promotion to the rank of second lieutenant on the 4th of March, 1846 to the 8th Infantry in St. Augustine, Florida. After arriving in August to be with his new unit, he and the unit were sent to Texas to be stationed at Corpus Christi, a small trading post located at the juncture of the Nueces River and the Gulf of Mexico, with the rest of Taylor's army of some 3,500 men. Longstreet, when not on duty, passed the time playing poker, hunting with fellow officers, and helping with the local theater that the officers had created to entertain the men. This all changed when, in March of 1846, the American army began marching beyond the Nueces River towards the Rio Grande. The land between the two rivers was roughly 150 miles wide and extended for hundreds of miles into the interior. This land was claimed by both Mexico and the United States, though both had avoided confrontation over it. However, the United States was becoming increasingly belligerent. Longstreet and his men were more than happy to oblige. Arriving at the river only a few weeks later, the Americans quickly built a fort they dubbed Fort Texas. Longstreet and the rest of the men braced for conflict as skirmishes between Mexican troops under the command of General Mariano Arista and American forces increased with regularity. On the 1st of May, Taylor marched with part of his army to search for supplies. A siege was quickly raised against Fort Texas by the Mexican army, and it remained under siege until the 8th of May, 1846 when Taylor's army returned. In a series of two battles known as the Battle of Palo Alto and the Battle of Resaca de la Palma, the American army decisively defeated the larger Mexican force. These were James Longstreet's first battles, and though he later said little of the conflicts, these events were to dramatically shape the rest of Longstreet's life. These events, combined with an ambush on an American cavalry unit by Mexican forces, gave President James Polk the sufficient evidence needed to convince the United States Congress to declare war. Polk, who had been looking for excuses to declare war, mobilized the American war machine, then a rather small force supplemented by large numbers of volunteers. Soon thousands of men across the United States were rushing to enlist in the conflict. While many joined as soldiers, others protested the war as a land grab and against the principles of the United States. Many in Congress believed that these actions to gain Texas and provoke war with Mexico were being conducted in order to aid slave-owning states by providing more land for slavery's expansion. However, Longstreet had bigger concerns than what the state of politics were as he marched towards the northern Mexican city of Monterrey. On the 19th of September, the American army arrived at Monterrey, a city that had been fortified to become a difficult target for the Americans. Undeterred by the heavily fortified nature of the city, American troops began advancing on the 21st of September. Longstreet's infantry advanced behind a mounted unit from Texas. As the bullets began flying, the Texas troops broke and ran. However, Longstreet and his men counterattacked and began to push back the Mexican forces. Next, they were assigned to take Fort Libertad on a nearby hill. Succeeding in his task, Longstreet and his men were soon part of the hand-to-hand combat in the streets of Monterrey on the 23rd of September. However, on the 26th of September, the Mexican army retreated, leaving the city in American hands. Longstreet had performed well in the eyes of his superiors and demonstrated his natural ability as a leader, and was thus promoted by his commanders to the rank of first lieutenant. James's 8th Infantry were soon ordered to join a separate invasion force led by General Winfield Scott, who was planning to attack the Mexican port city of Veracruz and march on Mexico City. Longstreet and his men participated in the amphibious landing on the beaches of Veracruz and soon after the surrender of the Mexican forces in Veracruz on the 29th of March, 1847. They were marching with the rest of the army towards Mexico City. The army ran smack into the forces of Antonio López de Santa Anna, who had been until recently in exile in Cuba. Santa Anna, the former president of Mexico who had attacked Texan forces at the Alamo, returned to lead the army and was once again elected president of the Mexican Republic. Using a route discovered by Captain Robert E. Lee, Scott's forces were able to flank the Mexican forces and defeat them at the Battle of Cerro Gordo. During the battle, Longstreet and his men were held in reserve and watched as their fellow countrymen pushed back Mexican forces. His chance for battle soon came on the outskirts of Mexico City when Longstreet helped lead his men to success in a battle near Churubusco. During the battle, Longstreet carried the regimental flag and was at the front of the charge on well-defended Mexican fortifications. For his bravery, Longstreet was promoted to captain. The young man from Georgia was quickly proving his value to his superiors. James was far from finished. Several weeks later, on the 8th of September, 1847, Longstreet's 8th Infantry were driven back with heavy casualties attacking. But during the battle, he served so valiantly that he was promoted to brevet major. For one of the worst students at the military academy to have climbed so high so fast would perhaps have astounded his teachers. While Longstreet was not much for school or exam rooms, he held traits that led to success on the battlefield. A quick wit, bravery, and good sense helped Longstreet on more than one occasion. These skills were once again shown at the Battle of Chapultepec on the 13th of September when he led his troops forward as the American assault was stalling. However, he took a musket ball to the leg and collapsed. The resulting injury proved to be tedious and he stayed in the home of the Escandón family, an elite Mexican family who cared for American soldiers. After a 2-month stay in Mexico recovering, Longstreet returned to the United States and went to visit his mother in Alabama. Throughout the war, Longstreet had carried a daguerreotype, an early type of photograph, of Louise still dedicated to her. The family now agreed the two could wed. On the 8th of March, 1848, James Longstreet was married to Louise Garland by William Kinkle, an Episcopalian minister. The couple made their way north to Poughkeepsie, New York, located a little over 80 miles north of New York City on the Hudson River, so James could serve as an army recruiter. Later that year, he transferred to Carlisle Barracks, located roughly 28 miles north of the small college town of Gettysburg. There, James's first son, John, was born on the 26th of December, 1848. He and Louise would have 10 children over the course of their marriage. Soon, the family was back en route to Texas, where Longstreet was assigned to be with his old unit, the 8th Infantry, in May of 1849. The 8th was stationed in San Antonio, the famous site of the Alamo Mission, an old Catholic mission where Texas troops had been besieged during the War for Texan independence. The Longstreets were soon joined by Louise's family due to her father becoming commander of the 8th Infantry. The Garlands arrived in December of 1849 to much fanfare by the local inhabitants. The 8th was primarily responsible for fighting Native American raiding parties from the Great Plains. Longstreet was promoted to act as the commissary, a position that required attentiveness to detail in order to maximize the use of supplies for the military. He transferred back to the 8th in March of 1851 and began leading scouting parties throughout Texas. Though he had been promoted to major during the war, his promotion was only valid during the conflict, and he had returned to the rank of lieutenant at the war's end. In early December 1852, Longstreet was promoted to the rank of captain. This occurred only 4 months before Louise gave birth to their third child, William Longstreet. However, tragedy soon struck when, on a trip to Washington, D.C., little William, now a year old, died on the 19th of July, 1854. Both parents were devastated at the loss of their son and buried him in Oak Hill Cemetery in Washington, D.C. Before returning to Texas, Longstreet now lived in Fort Bliss, close to the city of El Paso in West Texas. He spent much of his time leading his men of Company K against the local Apache tribe, who had continued to raid settlements and farms. On one occasion in January of 1855, Longstreet helped lead a strike force into Apache territory in the Guadalupe Mountains. This raid proved to be a failure and only resulted in 16 days of harsh cold and ice storms. Over the next few years, Longstreet increased his responsibilities when he would act temporarily as commander of the fort when the commanding officer was traveling. He finally became official commander in the spring of 1858. While there, the couple enjoyed themselves, building lifelong connections through social events with the soldiers and Mexican residents of El Paso. Despite the comforts of his position and the good company at the fort, Longstreet worried about his children and their education. While traveling in 1858, he learned that he had been given a promotion to the rank of major and assigned as a paymaster in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Longstreet, who had just placed his son Garland in a school in Yonkers, New York, immediately set out for his post, where he remained for 1 year until he was transferred to Albuquerque, New Mexico, to be under the command of his father-in-law. Yet as the transfer occurred in the fall of 1859, it happened at a time when the United States seemed to be sliding quickly towards disaster. All of James's life, he had watched as tensions continued to boil between the free North and slaveholding South. Though it had seemed that enough Americans were willing to compromise to forestall any armed conflict, it was the rise of the Republican Party, a new party formed in 1854 as an anti-slavery coalition, and the push of Southern slaveholders to expand and ensure their dominance in government policy that had pushed the nation to the brink of war. Conflicts in Kansas and other border states became increasingly violent when John Brown, a Northern abolitionist, attempted to launch a slave revolt in Virginia in October of 1859. The divides between North and South seemed irretractable. When Abraham Lincoln was elected as president on a purely Northern vote in November of 1860, the tensions burst into open rebellion and sedition as South Carolina and other Southern states began leaving the United States to become a new nation in December of 1860, the Confederate States of America. Longstreet, who learned the news weeks later, quickly sided with the Confederacy and began making plans to join the Confederate armies. He and others knew that the rupture was over slavery and its future in the new United States. Longstreet began in December of 1860 to correspond with the Confederate leadership, requesting a position in their army. He received a position as a lieutenant colonel on the 1st of May, 8 days before he resigned his commission in the United States Army. While still holding his position as major in the United States Army, Longstreet had joined the rebellion and had broken his oath to serve as a defender of the United States. In May of 1861, after waiting for his wife, who had just given birth to another daughter, Mary, and, in December of 1860, to recover, he resigned his commission with the United States Army. Longstreet finished up some last assignments and then began the trek to the east. Using the United States Army ambulance to convey his family, he continued to use U.S. supplies while acting as a Confederate officer. They arrived in El Paso, now part of the Confederacy, where Longstreet situated his family with friends in the city. He then quickly continued on towards Richmond, Virginia, via boat and the railroad. He arrived in the city, now the capital of the Confederate States of America, on the 21st of June, 1861. He met with the new Confederate President, Jefferson Davis, and learned that he had been promoted to Brigadier General, a request he accepted officially on the 25th of June. Longstreet soon reported to Manassas Junction on the 2nd of July, where he was assigned to work under P.G.T. Beauregard, a former U.S. soldier who had fought well in the Mexican-American War. However, Beauregard gained his greatest fame by leading the attack on the U.S.-held Fort Sumter in South Carolina on the 12th of April, 1861. Beauregard was well beloved by his men and seen as a hero by many Southerners as one of the new Confederacy's first heroes. Longstreet soon had command of a brigade of Virginia regiments. Longstreet and his men skirmished with Union troops on the 18th of July, and on the 21st of July, they held the center of the battle line but did not experience as much action as other areas. Still, he and his men were accorded part of the victory in the First Battle of Bull Run. In the aftermath of the battle, disease swept the Confederate camps, and Longstreet became sick. For over a week, he remained bedridden. But unlike the hundreds of other Confederates who were killed by disease, Longstreet survived. During the long months of waiting, Longstreet and his men served as frontline defenders near Fairfax Courthouse in Northern Virginia. Longstreet gathered around him a competent staff that he felt would be reliable in battle and became close friends with fellow generals, which resulted in his promotion to Major General in October of 1861. As the Confederate Army settled into winter quarters near Centerville, Virginia, a small town located 25 miles from the Union capital of Washington, D.C., Longstreet and his fellow officers socialized and drank heartily. He had numerous friends from his time in the Mexican-American War and from his duties on the frontier. He and fellow officers reminisced and enjoyed themselves as they awaited the next campaign season. However, for those officers on his staff, they learned that the old soldier could at times be grim and unsociable if things did not go as ordered. Longstreet also stood by fellow generals Joseph Johnston and P.G.T. Beauregard when they began to feud with Confederate President Jefferson Davis over the direction of the Confederate armies. It was in January of 1862 when tragedy struck the Longstreet family. Louise and their children had moved to Richmond, Virginia. However, scarlet fever, a bacterial fever that generally infects children and younger teenagers, was sweeping through the city. The entire Longstreet family had caught the disease, and James rushed to the capital city to be with his family. He arrived in time to be present at the death of his daughter, Mary Ann, who died on the 25th of January, 1862. On the very next day, his son, James Jr., died. On the 1st of February, Louise and James watched as their 6-year-old son, Augustus, also died. The Longstreets were heartbroken at the loss of 3 more of their children. Several days later, James returned to his post in Centerville, though his grief was readily apparent to his men and fellow officers. A scare with his eldest son, Garland, nearly dying from the dreaded disease pushed Longstreet closer to religion and led him to give up his lifelong hobby of gambling. As the winter months marched on and tragedy faded, the Confederate Army prepared for the Union advance. The head general of the Confederate armies, Joseph Johnston, withdrew his forces from Centerville at the end of February due to the poor defensive position. Longstreet and his men quickly obeyed orders and moved towards the Rappahannock River further to the south. However, the Union Army surprised the Confederacy by moving tens of thousands of troops via water to a location near the colonial city of Jamestown, located only 100 miles south of Richmond. However, led by the slow-moving and cautious George McClellan, the Union forces advanced slowly, giving the Confederate Army time to move to defend their capital. Longstreet and his men were soon moving from the Rappahannock towards Richmond. During the early part of the Union advance towards Richmond, as Confederate forces retreated from their positions, Longstreet and his men stopped in the town of Williamsburg, Virginia, home of the College of William and Mary. There, he and his men helped delay the United States Army, though at a severe cost of life, with over 1,500 dead in Longstreet's forces. James Longstreet came out of the battle a hero, praised for his decisiveness and ability to hold back the Federal assault. However, as he had already learned, the war was far from over. In the next 2-day battle between the 31st of May and the 1st of June at Seven Pines, Virginia, Longstreet made costly decisions, such as moving himself and many of his men to the rear of the fighting, thus causing challenges for the rest of the Confederate Army. The battle itself cost over 11,000 men on both sides and gained nothing for the Confederates. Subsequent chroniclers of the war laid blame for the failure on Longstreet, in part due to his indecisiveness. However, one result of the battle was the appointment of Robert E. Lee as commander of the Confederate forces that were massed around Richmond, Virginia. Robert E. Lee, a Virginian in his mid-50s, had been a career soldier and was a distinguished officer in the Mexican-American War. He had served as Jefferson Davis's military advisor since March of 1862 and had become a trusted advisor to the Confederate government. Appointed to take command of what was soon to be called the Army of Northern Virginia, Lee had to work to gain trust among men like Longstreet, who hardly knew him. Longstreet soon gained some confidence after their first meeting. In a few meetings, Lee was also impressed with Longstreet, calling him a capable soldier. In the coming weeks, Longstreet and Lee worked together as they prepared to launch an offensive against the Union forces massing south of Richmond. Over the next 2 months, a series of battles slowly drove the Union Army back towards Chesapeake Bay, through which Longstreet gained greater credibility as a capable and good commander. His courage in the 7 Days Campaign, a series of battles that occurred as the United States Army retreated from Richmond, Virginia, led Lee to begin to place greater trust in Longstreet and give him greater responsibility in the Army. In August of 1862, Longstreet and his men traveled north towards Fredericksburg, Virginia, to aid in the repulsion of another incoming Federal Army marching from the north towards Richmond. A series of small engagements occurred in late August as both armies sought to outmaneuver the other and gain the tactical advantage. These movements eventually resulted in the Battle of Second Manassas on the 29th and 30th of August, which for over a century was used as evidence by historians of Longstreet's failings as a commander. However, as noted by historian Geoffrey Wirt, Longstreet's actions likely prevented disaster for the Confederate Army, as he did not attack a position that was far more fortified than his commanding officer Robert E. Lee imagined. On the second day of the battle, the Confederate forces routed the Union troops and began their invasion of the border state of Maryland. Longstreet fully supported the invasion, though he disagreed with some of the specifics of Lee's plans, such as his plan to attack Harper's Ferry, a small Union garrison that could potentially harass the Confederate Army supply lines. This invasion force was soon met by the Union armies near Sharpsburg, Maryland, in a battle that would be immortalized as the Battle of Antietam, which occurred on the 17th of September, 1862. During the battle, Longstreet was cool and composed, unrattled by the volume of fire emanating from Union lines. The battle was the worst of the war, and several times the Confederate lines broke, with Longstreet said to have helped restore order during such moments. Over 24,000 men lost their lives in battle, and thousands more were wounded, maimed, or sickened. It has remained the bloodiest single day of conflict in American history. The surrounding countryside was completely devastated, leaving nothing but destruction in the wake of the two armies. Once fertile fields now appeared to be straight from a nightmare. Both sides claimed the battle to be a victory, and on the 22nd of September, the meaning of the Civil War began to change. Previously, the North had avoided making the war about slavery, many justifying their enlistment by devotion to country. However, many others also enlisted in the hope of beating back slavery. Southern leadership had always emphasized protecting slavery as one of the key reasons for the war. Leaders had declared that it was to be a foundational part of the Confederacy. But on the 22nd of September, with Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, the Union declared slavery void for those states in rebellion. Though not attacking slavery for those still loyal to the Union, the floodgates had been opened to transforming the Civil War into a war not just about the unity of a nation but also about the freedom of millions of enslaved people in the United States. Longstreet and other Confederate generals were more than aware that this step would mean there would be no peaceful reunion. Though some viewed this as a temporary measure to win the war, many saw this as a new dawn of freedom. Following Antietam, the Confederate Army drew back to Virginia to regroup and prepare for spring. Longstreet was appointed on the 9th of October as a lieutenant general, one of the highest officers in the Confederate Army at the recommendation of General Lee, and was given command of the 1st Corps, which consisted of 5 divisions or approximately 41,000 troops. Longstreet had soldiers from 8 Confederate states under his command. His men were soon to be engaged in the heavy fighting around the town of Fredericksburg, Virginia. The Union forces, led by newly appointed Commander Ambrose Burnside, sought to cross the Rappahannock River and seize the heights near the town. However, after several days of bloody fighting, the Federal troops were repulsed, having lost over 12,000 men to the Confederates' 5,000. The historic town had become a death trap for thousands of young men. Longstreet and other generals watched as thousands fell in gruesome slaughter. Yet despite the horrors surrounding him, Longstreet once again displayed calmness, firmness, and savagery. The Confederates had succeeded in defeating a numerically superior army. While morale sagged in the North, jubilation flooded the South. Louise arrived soon after the battle to live with Longstreet in his winter quarters, allowing the couple to spend some time together before the next campaign season. In February 1863, Longstreet and his 1st Corps were detached to southern Virginia and North Carolina to counteract Federal operations in the area. While Robert E. Lee hoped to deliver a crushing blow, Longstreet favored a longer but what he believed to be a more realistic approach of defeating small Union armies and then gathering for a major conflict with the United States Army of the Potomac. Longstreet remained in the area until May, when he was ordered back to aid Lee's army as the Union was once again marching towards Richmond. He arrived to be present for a serious debate over how to approach the coming campaign season. Though he later distanced himself from Lee's decision to march north, at the time he was very supportive of an offensive to force the United States to concede the war. On the 3rd of June, 1863, the Army of Northern Virginia began its march northwards, ready to awe and shock the people. Few could imagine what was soon to happen and how much it would devastate the Confederate war effort. By late June, Lee's army had arrived in Pennsylvania and seized the city of Chambersburg. The army was confident, sure of its ability to defeat Union forces and finally end the war by choosing a good spot to defeat the Union army. However, Union forces beat the Confederates to the punch, and a cavalry unit turned the Confederate army to the town of Gettysburg, a small backwater in central Pennsylvania. On the 1st of July, 1863, Longstreet began moving his men quickly towards the town, and upon seeing the town, the general was deeply concerned over the strength of position that the Union forces had chosen. He voiced his concerns to Lee, though the latter disregarded his advice in part because of the impracticality of Longstreet's suggestion to perform a flanking maneuver in an unfamiliar area. The next day, as the Union and Confederate forces massed, Longstreet was assigned to the right flank and given the greatest charge of the battle to roll back the Union flank. Longstreet, smarting over Lee's unwillingness to listen, was less enthusiastic and, as a result, was less vigorous in his attack. Still, his men fought gallantly and pushed the Union lines back. However, he and his men paid dearly for their efforts, losing over 4,000 men that day. The battlefield would become famous, and the names of battle sites etched in history. Places such as the Peach Orchard, Devil's Den, and Little Round Top were places of terror and violence that Longstreet and his men would not soon forget. Longstreet, always sensitive to the senseless loss of life, was deeply frustrated at Lee's reckless frontal assaults. On the 3rd of July, Lee once again asked for an assault on the entrenched Union position. Longstreet opposed this plan, particularly given the losses suffered by his men. Yet once Lee issued the order, he agreed to follow. Assigned to conduct a frontal assault on the center of the Union lines, Longstreet and his men, along with units from other divisions, did not believe the assault would succeed. And he was right. Though his men fought well, they were roundly defeated and driven back, losing entire divisions in the futile assault. The Confederate army withdrew and began the long march back to Virginia. The Battle of Gettysburg would haunt Longstreet for the rest of his life, as fellow Confederates lamented that had he been more decisive, then the war could have been won. Rather than blame Robert E. Lee, Confederate apologists blamed his right-hand man as the culprit for the South's failure at Gettysburg. For the rest of his life, Longstreet pointed the blame to Lee, stating he had obeyed his officer and that it was not his desire to engage in battle on such an undesirable field. Following the battle, Longstreet requested political friends in the Confederate Congress to transfer him to the West in order to no longer work under Lee. He was granted the request and, with 2 infantry divisions, was sent to help the Confederate armies in Tennessee. Longstreet's men departed on the 9th of September, heading towards Chattanooga, Tennessee. He and his men saw their first action in Tennessee on the 20th of September at the Battle of Chickamauga near Chattanooga. Longstreet was confident of success, but his commanding officer, General Braxton Bragg, declared the battle lost and refused to send more reinforcements. Still, Longstreet and his men succeeded in driving back the Union forces, and Longstreet was roundly praised for his efforts. While in Tennessee, Longstreet helped lead the movement to remove Braxton Bragg, his commanding officer, whom he viewed as incompetent. Working behind the scenes, Longstreet worked to form a coalition of fellow lower-ranking generals that would unite against Bragg. However, instead, the Confederate President Jefferson Davis continued to support Bragg, undermining the entire operation. In retaliation for Longstreet's efforts to weaken him, Bragg reduced Longstreet's corps to a minimal amount. The conflicts among the generals bled over into the fighting, as the Confederate leadership was ill-prepared for its next battle at Chattanooga, where the Confederates laid siege to the Union Army in the city. Furthermore, Bragg had Longstreet and his corps moved to eastern Tennessee. While not a demotion, the object was likely to remove Longstreet from the heart of the action. Longstreet left on the 5th of November, 1863, likely grateful to be far gone from Bragg. In eastern Tennessee, Longstreet went to work quickly, moving his men to attack the Union forces. Initially successful in driving back the United States troops, his forces were forced to stop by Fort Sanders, a fortress located on a small hill near East Knoxville, Tennessee. When Longstreet attempted to launch an assault on the fort on the night of the 29th of November, 1863, the results were disastrous. Hundreds of Confederates died in minutes due to lack of planning on Longstreet's part and underestimating the resolve of the Union garrison. Following the failed assault, Longstreet was ordered to Georgia to return to be with the defeated and fleeing army of Braxton Bragg. On the night of the 4th of December, 1863, Longstreet and his men began their retreat. The failure to take Knoxville led to widespread criticism of the once favored general, who in turn bristled with indignation. Furthermore, bold plans Longstreet had to conquer Kentucky in order to influence the 1864 United States election were shelved by Confederate leadership. Longstreet was well aware of the insecurity Lincoln faced in obtaining another 4 years in the White House. The slow pace of the war, the loss of life, and the drafts had all helped make Lincoln far less popular among many people. Furthermore, the status of the war, with Union armies bogged down and failing to gain victories, had deeply subdued morale across the North. Longstreet wanted to help push the U.S. election, or aid towards a peace candidate who would end the war with an intact Confederacy. However, his plans were dismissed as too unrealistic, and he was transferred back to Virginia. In Virginia, the Confederates now faced a new opposing general, Longstreet's old friend Ulysses S. Grant, the hero of Vicksburg and other victories in the Western theater of the Civil War. At the first confrontation between the two friends at the Battle of Wilderness in May of 1864, the Confederacy failed to drive the Union from the area. The battle was perhaps Longstreet's finest hour, as he successfully conducted his battle plan to perfection. However, during the battle, Longstreet got caught in friendly fire and took a bullet to his shoulder, which went through his neck. Though not killed, he was removed to the back of the conflict. His injury removed him from the front line, which in turn stalled the Confederate offensive, thus denying the Confederates the ability to drive the Union out of Virginia. Longstreet spent the next month resting and recovering before requesting leave to go home to Georgia. Longstreet left for Georgia in July with his wife and children, who had joined him following his injury. He spent the rest of the summer with his family at his estate. James continued to write to Lee, learning that the Union was grinding down the Confederates and slowly moving closer and closer to Richmond. In September, Longstreet headed back to Richmond, arriving in the capital on the 25th of September. Though still crippled in his arm from the bullet, Lee and others wanted Longstreet's mind to help stop the Union war machine, which had been reinvigorated by Abraham Lincoln's re-election and William T. Sherman's victory in Atlanta. Sherman, a subordinate of General Grant, had launched a scorched earth campaign by destroying the infrastructure throughout Georgia in his famous March to the Sea. This campaign disheartened the Confederacy and also badly ruined supply lines. The Confederate Army was reeling, and on the 2nd of April began the retreat from Richmond. After a series of small engagements and the collapse of the Confederate Army on the 9th of April, Robert E. Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. On the 12th of April, Longstreet took leave of the army to return to Georgia, leaving behind his career to pursue peace. Though he was no longer a soldier, the scars of war remained with him for the rest of his life, driving him to try to avoid war at all costs. Following the war, Longstreet and his family moved to New Orleans, a prosperous city that had survived the fiery inferno of the previous 2 years of war due to it having been conquered in 1862 by Union forces. Longstreet joined a cotton brokerage led by 2 former Confederate officers in an effort to expand his material wealth. When he traveled to Washington, D.C. to apply for a pardon, the new president, Andrew Johnson, a Kentucky Unionist who had been Abraham Lincoln's vice president during his second term, denied his request. After Lincoln's assassination by John Wilkes Booth in 1865, Johnson took charge of the United States and its efforts to reconstruct the defeated South. Johnson explained that to pardon Longstreet was impossible because Longstreet had caused the North far too much trouble during the war. As a result, James Longstreet remained a man with no political rights and no pardon. Still, he sought to rebuild his life and returned with Louise and his children to New Orleans. Longstreet began to travel extensively for his work, looking to secure cotton crops for the firm. He also dabbled in railroads and insurance, focusing his efforts fully on establishing a new life. Longstreet watched as the radical Republican faction rose to prominence in Congress. The radical Republicans had been the most anti-slavery and most pro-war faction during the war. Focusing on radically altering the makeup of the South, many radical Republicans sought to provide political rights to the formerly enslaved African Americans. Many former Confederates resisted, but Longstreet reminded those around him publicly to pursue moderation and acknowledge that they were a conquered people. In New Orleans, the Republican Party courted Longstreet, and he felt it was better to cooperate than resist. Longstreet refused to rise in further rebellion and instead believed that Southern whites could still control politics through manipulating African American politics. Despite warnings from family and friends, Longstreet urged in a public letter on the 8th of June, 1866 for Southern whites to work with Republicans in order to control the Black American vote. While white Southerners condemned Longstreet and Northerners praised him, Southern Black Americans condemned Longstreet's racist view of controlling African American politics. In August 1866, Longstreet fled New Orleans with his family following the backlash from the letter. Over the next 2 years, Longstreet periodically returned, though he spent much of his time in the North and Virginia. During this period, he endorsed Ulysses S. Grant's presidential run, further inflaming hatred against him in the South. Grant subsequently gave Longstreet a job as surveyor of customs in New Orleans. Having received a pardon in June 1868, Longstreet was free to take the position. However, for many Southerners, Longstreet had betrayed the cause and was a traitor. As the lost cause myth grew in the South, which argued that the Civil War had been about states' rights and that the Confederate armies were only defeated by greater Northern manpower rather than by the righteousness of the cause of the North, Longstreet became one of the narrative's villains, a man whose failures as a commander had cost the Confederacy the victory. Longstreet, well aware that he was the scapegoat, was shocked that his fellow Southerners so quickly turned on him. In his mind, the blood and carnage of war was not worth resistance to the North. In the 1870s, Longstreet had become fully involved in the Louisiana Republican Party and had been appointed as a major general of the state militia, which included both black and white troops. By 1872, Longstreet was known as a radical Republican, an identity that won him few allies in the South. After assuming command of the New Orleans Metropolitan Police Force, a largely black force, he successfully put down Louisiana Democrat efforts to overturn the election in favor of their candidate through armed resistance. The conflict, however, continued to escalate as the New Orleans White League, a white supremacist group, continued to fight against the Republican government. In September of 1874, tensions boiled over into armed conflict. Longstreet attempted to put down an armed insurrection in New Orleans but was hit and taken prisoner. This event led to further denunciation of Longstreet by fellow white Southerners who viewed him ultimately as a traitor. Shortly after the conflict, Longstreet was relieved as commander of the force and left behind New Orleans politics. In the summer of 1875, Longstreet and his family left New Orleans and returned to Georgia, settling near Gainesville. Throughout 1876 and 1877, Longstreet continued to work his business connections and also involved himself in national politics. In March of 1877, he converted to the Roman Catholic faith, thus further enraging white Protestant Southerners. His conversion was deep and sincere as he sought a closer connection with God. The man who had once been a hero of the South had become one of its worst enemies. Still, his loyalty to the Republican government led to his promotion as an official United States minister to the Ottoman Empire in May of 1880. However, Longstreet was ill-qualified and only served a short time in the post. After a tour of Europe in 1881, Longstreet was recalled to the United States and took the position as U.S. Marshal for Georgia. His years as a marshal were marred with controversy as some of the members of his staff were found to be involved in corruption schemes. Though declared innocent by investigators, they recommended that Longstreet be relieved due to incompetence. In 1884, seen as a liability to the Republican Party, Longstreet was asked to resign and return to his farm, a passion he had developed since the war. However, a devastating fire in 1889 destroyed his farm and much of his war mementos. This tragedy was followed by a much more devastating loss, that of his wife, Louise, in December of 1889. Longstreet, devastated by the loss, focused on writing his memoirs. Working without his years of notes that had been lost in the fire, Longstreet began again and focused on casting himself as a tragic hero in the Civil War. For decades, Longstreet had been attacked by former Confederate officers for causing the loss at Gettysburg, an accusation which he vehemently contested. After years of work, in the spring of 1896, Longstreet published his memoirs, which were immediately received with both love and hatred. Longstreet, long used to the criticism, decried his detractors and continued to seek to establish a better life. One way he did so was through his marriage to Helen Dorch in Atlanta in September of 1897. The marriage shocked his children, particularly because she was over 40 years his junior. Though Longstreet's children never cared for the new bride, Helen was a loyal defender of James Longstreet even after his death. She gladly married the old general and brought a spark of light to his life. The couple soon moved to Washington, D.C., where Longstreet assumed the post of United States Commissioner of Railroads, a prestigious position that came as a result of his efforts to help Republican William McKinley in his election. However, Longstreet's health began to fail, and on the morning of January 2, 1904, Longstreet died due to complications from pneumonia. His funeral was held 4 days later and was widely attended. The hero and villain of the South now lay in final peace in the Gainesville Cemetery. Over the next several decades, Longstreet continued to be framed as the cause of the South's failure in the Civil War, particularly his role at the Battle of Gettysburg. Historians who relied upon narratives of the lost cause were quick to condemn the general. However, recent histories have since taken a more balanced view of him. Some popular works, such as The Killer Angels by Michael Shira, cast Longstreet in a much more sympathetic light. Debates still rage as to how the man should be viewed, particularly given his efforts to defend slavery. James Longstreet was a brilliant military tactician, a career soldier, a businessman, a planter, a slaveholder, a Republican, a foreign minister, a writer, and was seen by many as a traitor. He grew up in Georgia, rose to prominence during the Mexican-American War, helped lead Confederate armies as Robert E. Lee's right-hand man, served in Republican governments, led a black police force against anti-abolitionists, converted to Roman Catholicism, and spent his life fighting to preserve his legacy as one of honor and valor rather than one as a traitor. What do you think of James Longstreet? Was he a brilliant general or was he a traitor to his country? Please let us know in the comments section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. The man known to history as Emperor Nerva was born Marcus Cus Nerva, most likely on the 8th of November in the year 30 AD, though sources suggest that the year of his birth was 35 AD. This is just the first of many details about Nerva's life for which we have either a lack of or conflicting evidence. While the year of his birth is debatable, we do know for certain that he was born in the village of Narni in the Umbria region of central Italy, to the north of the city of Rome. Nerva was named after his father, a prominent political figure within the early Roman Empire, one who was a member of the Roman Senate, the foremost political body of the state, and who served as consul, the highest office within the Roman government, next only to that of the emperor. In 40 AD, when Nerva was still a child, the Nerva family, the gens Nerva, were a patrician family, meaning that centuries earlier they had been amongst the lower classes of the Roman Republic. However, many plebeian families had acquired immense wealth and prestige during the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, as the expansion of the Roman state created opportunities for upward social mobility. The Nerva family had been amongst those who benefited, and in the middle of the 1st century BC, during the dying days of the Roman Republic, Nerva's great-grandfather had emerged as a rising political figure, gaining a place in the Senate and serving as governor of the province of Asia, one of the wealthiest provinces of the empire in the mid-30s BC. Hence, by the time Nerva was born, the family had been a well-established political family for nearly a century. Nerva's mother was Sergia Plautilla, a woman who hailed from the gens Sergia, an old patrician family that had formed part of the Roman aristocracy in the early days of the Roman Republic. Indeed, the family claimed to be descended from Aeneas, an exile from the fabled Trojan War who had allegedly settled in Italy years after the conflict. This was a period in which the Romans were playing up their ties to the ancient Trojans, most notably through the poet Virgil's epic poem, the Aeneid, a work which claimed that the Romans were descended ultimately from Prince Aeneas of Troy. Nerva's father had at least one other child, a daughter named Coa. Nerva was born during a period when the instability that characterized the leadership of the Roman Empire for so much of its history, and which would pave the way for Nerva to become emperor one day himself, was becoming apparent. The first Roman emperor, Caesar Augustus, who established the idea of the Principate, that one man had primacy above all others within the Roman state, had reigned for 4 decades between 27 BC and 14 AD. His had been a highly successful reign, and there is every indication that he was immensely popular amongst the Roman people, not least because he brought peace after decades of civil war which had destroyed the Roman Republic. This was not the case with his successors, though, when Nerva was born, Augustus's stepson Tiberius had been emperor for many years. He was an unpopular ruler who spent much time absent from Rome at his villa on the island of Capri, where it was said he lived a life of debauchery. Several years later, Tiberius was succeeded by the young Caligula, popularly regarded as a deranged individual who it was claimed wished to make his favorite horse, Incitatus, a consul of Rome. Before he could do so, Caligula was killed in a palace coup in 41 AD, to be succeeded by his paternal uncle, Claudius. Emperor Claudius brought sanity and stability back to affairs, but the dispatching of Caligula had set a precedent. If an emperor did not have enough support either amongst the military, the Senate, or the people of Rome, he could be overthrown. Such a scenario was to bring Nerva to the imperial office himself one day. Nerva was the first of Rome's emperors for which there is a lack of source material with which to construct his life and reign. This is in part because he became emperor at an advanced age and was never expected to rule the empire. As a result, little attention was paid to his early career. in the 1st century, and later historians seem to have been unable to find out much about his earlier affairs. Also, for the 1st century and a quarter of the Roman Empire, from Caesar Augustus to Nerva's immediate predecessor, Domitian, we have excellent histories written by the Roman historians Suetonius and Tacitus, two learned men who lived in the late 1st century AD and into the 2nd century, and were witnesses to many of the events and reigns they described. Both of them stopped at the end of the Flavian dynasty and so did not cover Nerva's reign. Furthermore, while other historians later decided to pick up where Suetonius and Tacitus ended, in the case of two such works, the Residential Gesti of Ammianus Maecenas and the anonymously authored Historia Augusta, the sections dealing with the reign of Nerva have not survived down to the present day. Therefore, our best source for Nerva's reign is the Historian Ar Romana, or Roman History of Cassius Dio, a Greco-Roman historian who was writing over a century after Nerva's reign and who was far from a contemporary witness of the events he described. In terms of ancient historical writers, there are some other snippets on Nerva's reign to be found, such as a minor entry by the 4th century historian Aelius Victor Caesarius, a series of short entries on each Roman emperor over the space of 4 centuries. Contemporaries of Nerva also shed light on his reign, notably in the letters of Pliny the Younger, a governor of the province of Bithynia and Pontus during the reign of Nerva's successor, Trajan, and the satirical verses of the poet Juvenal. With these, we can reconstruct some elements of Nerva's life and brief reign, though, as will become clear, many things about him are and will inevitably remain uncertain. While Nerva's life and career become more transparent over time, beyond the details of his family background, his early life is a black hole. He would have received the advanced education of a senator's son in Rome and on the family's estates in the Italian countryside, learning about Rome's history and rise to power, as well as the arts of rhetoric and oratory, the better to deliver speeches in the Senate himself one day, should he succeed his father there. He may well have been exposed to the Stoic school of philosophy, which had become so popular amongst the Roman elite by the middle of the 1st century AD. It seems reasonable to assume he was a traditionalist and someone of modest disposition, as he was described by Aurelius Victor as quite wise and moderate, and allegedly refused, when he became emperor, to have any elaborate statues of gold or silver erected in his likeness. Beyond these suppositions, his early life, actions, and character remain a mystery. We begin to stand on slightly firmer ground once we reach the 60s AD. By then, Nero had become emperor, perhaps having conspired to have his father-in-law Claudius poisoned with the help of his mother in 54 AD. We don't hear much about Nerva for the first half of young Nero's reign, though this is not surprising in some respects, as he was still a relatively young man. He finally emerges from the shadows in 65 AD when he was elected to the office of praetor. The praetors were important officials who had been elected in Rome for centuries. Some fulfilled military duties, while others were charged with managing the civil administration of the city, often overseeing the courts or public works. It seems Nerva was involved in the latter, as there is no record at all of him engaging in any major military command during his lifetime. A stray reference by the satirist and poet Martial, who was an exact contemporary of Nerva, refers to him as the Tibullus of his age. This was an allusion to a very well-respected poet who had flourished in the early days of the empire under Augustus, and Martial's description of Nerva in this way suggests that the future emperor was possessed of considerable literary ability. Nerva's election as one of the praetors of Rome in the year 65 corresponds with his involvement in the uncovering and foiling of the Pisonian conspiracy. Although Nero's reign had started well and he had been viewed as a promising ruler for several years, he is understood to have become more autocratic over time. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD was a turning point, with Nero's decision to requisition large swathes of land in the center of the city in the aftermath of the fire in order to build himself a grand palace, generating hostility amongst both the common people and the political classes. The following year, a conspiracy was initiated by a leading Roman politician, Gaius Calpurnius Piso. He recruited many members of the Senate and elements amongst the Praetorian Guard. We get an idea of how extensive the plot was by the fact that details of it first reached the government after details of it were leaked to someone at Mytilene, a port south of Rome towards modern Naples, known then as Neapolis. This suggests that a wide network of people throughout Italy were involved. The plan was to kill Nero and for Piso to become emperor instead. In the event, the government was ahead of Piso and the plot was foiled before it was ever put into action. Many of the conspirators were arrested, and others were ordered to commit suicide. Although the details are unclear, Nerva was central to uncovering and foiling the Bonian conspiracy, and in the aftermath of it, he was much lauded. A statue of him was set up in the imperial palace to honor his service. The Bonian conspiracy was simply the prelude to a more significant revolt against Nero. The following year, a revolt broke out in the east of the empire in Judea, where the Jewish population was angered by decades of their religion being disrespected by successive emperors and governors of their province, as well as the desecration of the sacred temple of Jerusalem by the Romans. The first Jewish revolt acted as a catalyst for discontent at Nero's rule to emerge elsewhere, and in the year 68 AD, simultaneous revolts broke out amongst the governors of the provinces in Gaul and Hispania. One of these, Servius Sulpicius Galba, eventually marched on Rome and was declared emperor. When it became clear to Nero that neither the Praetorian Guard nor the Senate were willing to support him, he fled from Rome and committed suicide. Galba was in turn overthrown in a palace coup in January 69 AD, following which Marcus Salvius Otho, a former governor of the province of Lusitania around modern-day Portugal, was proclaimed as the new emperor by the Praetorian Guard. This was something of a boon to Nerva, as Otho was none other than Nero's sister's brother-in-law, Coa having married Otho's brother some years earlier. While Nerva's relationship with Otho should have seen him welcome his sister's brother-in-law's ascent as emperor, Otho's reign would prove as short-lived as Galba's had been. No sooner had he claimed the imperial office than news arrived in Rome that a senior military commander at the northern border along the river Rhine in Germania, named Vitellius, had been proclaimed as emperor by his legions. He marched south and in April 69 became the third man to hold the title of Roman emperor that year after defeating Otho at the Battle of Bedriacum, with Otho committing suicide in the aftermath of his defeat. There was no honeymoon period for Vitellius either. Yet another military commander, Titus Flavius Vespasian, soon emerged as a rival. Far to the east, Vespasian was in charge of suppressing a major revolt of the Jewish people in Judea at the time and soon had gained the support of the legions across the eastern Mediterranean. In the autumn, forces loyal to him began to descend on Italy, and early that winter, the Vespasian faction defeated Vitellius, ensuring that Vespasian became the fourth and final emperor of the year 69 AD. There would be no further rival. A new dynasty was formed, the Flavian dynasty, which would rule Rome for over a quarter of a century. As with Otto's accession at the start of the year, the claiming of the imperial title at the end of the year of the four emperors benefited Nerva. The exact relationship between Nerva and the Flavians remains, as so much else of Nerva's early life, something of a mystery. However, there was clearly a relationship of considerable kind. While Vespasian was away in the east, Nerva had played a part in looking after his young son, a boy by the name of Domitian, who had been left behind in Rome while Vespasian and his eldest son, Titus, oversaw the suppression of the Jewish revolt. He continued to do so for months after Vespasian became emperor, as he was still in the eastern Mediterranean. Vespasian rewarded him appropriately. In 71 AD, Nerva was appointed as one of the consuls for that year. 2 consuls served each year, and they were the single most important magistrates in the Roman state, the equivalent of prime ministers back in the days of the Republic. Although the power of the consuls was greatly reduced once the empire came into being, the title still carried great prestige. For Nerva to be appointed to the office so early in Vespasian's reign points to his close connections to the Flavians. He clearly continued to be held in high regard as Vespasian reigned, though again, the details of his activities at this time are frustratingly limited. One thing which seems evident is that he had now conclusively determined not to take a wife. It seems certain that Nerva never married, nor did he have any children. Vespasian died in the year 79 AD, by which time Nerva was either in his mid-40s or almost 50, depending on the year of his birth. He was succeeded by his eldest son, Titus, the first time in Roman imperial history that an emperor was succeeded by his biological son. By all accounts, Titus was extremely well-liked, which ensured that his death just 2 years into his reign was all the more lamented. Having only had daughters, Titus did not have a son to succeed him, and so his younger brother, Domitian, now became the third emperor of the Flavian dynasty in a swift turnover of rulers. Some suspected at the time that Titus's rather sudden and somewhat unexplained death in his early 40s was suspicious and queried if foul play had led to him assuming the imperial title in 81 AD. His accession certainly did not damage Nerva's career prospects. In fact, if Suetonius's biographical history of Domitian's life and reign is to be believed, there is a possibility that Nerva had engaged in sexual relations with the new emperor many years earlier. It must be said, though, that Suetonius, while a tremendously useful historian and source for early imperial history, was also prone to injecting scandalous anecdotes and gossip into his work and was trying to suggest that Domitian was possessed of poor morals by inferring he had prostituted himself in some way. As a young man, whether Suetonius' statement can be read literally in any way may be unclear, but there is no doubt that Nerva continued to find some favor with Domitian as emperor. In the 80s, it was a peculiar reign, one which mimicked that of Nero 3 decades earlier to a great extent. Domitian was well liked to begin with and had some promising years as emperor. Then it all started to go wrong. His great sin was in failing to maintain the support of a majority of the key constituencies which any Roman emperor needed to be able to rule effectively and to preserve his position. These were the Senate, the Praetorian Guard, the staff of the imperial household, and the people of Rome. Gradually, Domitian alienated all of these groups. The most egregious failure was in his disrespecting the Senate, its ancient traditions, and its sense of the majesty of its members. One wonders what Nerva himself, the leading figure of an established and esteemed senatorial family, must have made of this. What it all amounted to was a growing discontent with Domitian's reign by the end of the 80s, much as Nero's rule had run into trouble in the mid-60s AD. A conspiracy, much like the Pisonian conspiracy, was soon being hatched, and incredibly, in a déjà vu-like occurrence, Nerva was once again central to foiling it, just as he had helped to scuttle Piso's plan back in 65 AD. This time, the conspiracy was hatched by Lucius Antonius Saturninus. Saturninus was a Roman senator and a military commander, one who had been appointed as a governor of a string of provinces under Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian. The last of these was an appointment as governor of Germania Superior, a frontier province in Germania where numerous legions were stationed to protect the empire's northern border, the most militarized part of the entire Roman Empire. In January 89 AD, Saturninus launched a revolt here, expecting that he would be able to gather the support of several Roman legions and having also organized an alliance with the Chatti, a Germanic tribe that lived just beyond the border. It all quickly went wrong, with the Chatti being prevented from crossing the river Rhine when an unseasonably warm winter melted the river early. While acting on intelligence of the revolt, some other Roman commanders crushed the revolt. Saturninus was executed. What role Nerva played in this is unclear, but he was evidently involved in suppressing the revolt in some fashion, as in the year 90 AD, he was one of 13 individuals Domitian rewarded for their loyalty and their actions in suppressing Saturninus' rebellion by appointing all of them as extraordinary consuls for that year. Nerva's apparent role in uncovering and foiling the conspiracy of Saturninus and the revolt of the Chatti is interesting. This was the second time Nerva had apparently been central to revealing a plot against an emperor, having done so previously with the Pisonian conspiracy against Nero a quarter of a century earlier. What's doubly unusual about this is that he emerged. Simply does not allow for more than speculation, and by its very nature, a conspiracy to murder an emperor tends to be secretive. Moreover, the two best sources for Domitian's assassination, Suetonius and Cassius Dio, openly admit that the identity of the conspirators was a matter of hearsay. On the other side of things, we know that Nerva pardoned many of Domitian's former allies and did not exact revenge against the Flavian faction after he became emperor for the perceived abuses of Domitian's reign. Given all of this, most historians have concluded that Nerva was perhaps aware of the conspiracy but was not a leader of it. Instead, he was chosen by the Senate to become emperor because he was a consensus candidate, a respected, uncontroversial figure, one who had the support of a lot of the traditionalists within the Senate but who had also been an ally of the Flavians. This allowed him to reconcile any factions which might emerge once Domitian was assassinated and thus prevent a civil war of the kind which had occurred back in 69 AD, the year of the four emperors. As they met to appoint a successor to Domitian, the senators would also have been aware that Nerva was an elderly man and childless. He was a good candidate to serve as an interim emperor while a more long-lasting solution was found, though it was assumed that he would not rule for long, being 66 years of age already if Cassius Dio was correct in suggesting his year of birth was 30 AD. Nerva's first acts were to overhaul the government and reform both the courts and the civil administration in the aftermath of the supposed years of tyranny under Domitian. Treason trials, for instance, were abolished, and many people whose cases were pending before the courts for some alleged crime against Domitian and his government were quickly pardoned and allowed to return to normal life. There were no such things as large prisons in Roman times. The punishments one might suffer instead centered on being enslaved, being crucified, or forced to commit suicide, being press-ganged into the military or the navy, or being exiled. Death or exile beyond the borders of the empire was the typical punishment for political crimes. While Nerva couldn't bring people back from the dead, he did recall many people who had been exiled by Domitian back to Rome. More controversially was his approach towards close supporters and confidants of Domitian. He did not exact revenge against the former emperor's faction, though he did issue a decree of damnatio memoriae. This was a Roman process whereby the memory of a deceased individual was condemned, and steps were taken to destroy all records of their ever having existed. In this case, by removing Domitian's name from public places around Rome, having statues of him defaced, and generally tearing down the public monuments erected in Domitian's honor. The cornerstone of Nerva's reign was the re-establishment of harmonious relations between the imperial household and the Roman Senate. Had been around a long time when he became emperor, he had seen both in the mid-60s AD and again 30 years later with Domitian that both emperors had brought about their own downfalls by losing the support of both the Senate and the Roman military. As we will see, Nerva never obtained the support of the army to any extent, but he didn't need it so long as he had the Senate as an ally. He did win the support of the Senate, he showed the proper deference which was expected under the Augustan system, and he made it clear that the cursus honorum, the system whereby senators would be promoted through different offices to become senior magistrates, would be brought back to its traditional way of functioning. Most importantly, he made it clear that differences of opinion would be respected, and he took an oath on becoming emperor that he would not order the execution of senators arbitrarily for simply speaking against his policies and conduct. In a direct repudiation of Domitian's later years, he turned to the Senate for advice on policy matters. He even agreed to make Gaius Rufus the consul for a year, despite Rufus allegedly having been a potential rival to succeed Domitian as emperor. All of this was effective. Nerva famously quipped that if he retired to become a private citizen, no man in the Senate would seek retribution against him for anything he had done while emperor. This changed relationship with the Senate is indicative of one of the major factors involved in Nerva's ascent as emperor. There were two kinds of emperor that might rule. The empire had been forged in 27 BC by Caesar Augustus through constitutional changes in which he asserted his position as princeps. At least at first, this did not involve him establishing himself as an autocratic ruler. Instead, it was meant to be a statement about his position as the first citizen of Rome, a man who stood above others yet who would rule with the established aristocracy and political classes. This was the concept of princeps, that Augustus was the first citizen but not a tyrant. The other kind of emperor was what Augustus and his successors quickly evolved into, imperators who exercised imperium, whereby they were all-powerful rulers, which the Romans would previously have considered to be a sort of oriental despot, like the kings of Persia and Parthia far to the east. By the time of the Flavians, it had become all too common for emperors to rule through autocratic imperium rather than through more conciliatory principatus. It was Nerva's achievement to rebalance this political equilibrium, assuring the Roman aristocracy and political classes that he was returning to the original concept of being a first citizen rather than an all-powerful emperor. Those who followed him in the imperial office during the 2nd century AD would adhere to this concept to a greater extent than Nerva's predecessors, leading to more pronounced political stability in Rome for decades to come. Nerva's conciliatory approach to being emperor and the fact that he was effectively elected to the office following Domitian's assassination meant he had no shortage of political opponents. Some of these were found within the Senate, hardliners who believed that Nerva should have gone much further in attacking the people who had enabled Domitian as his reign descended into tyranny. The primary constituency opposed to Nerva, however, was the military. Nerva, as we have seen, had virtually no military experience or background of any kind. This was a peculiar situation amongst a people whose history was so intimately connected with military prowess and conquest. Even a disliked emperor like Tiberius had been active as a military commander on several fronts in Germania and the Western Balkans in his younger years before becoming emperor. Nerva was instead perceived as an old, weak, and pacifist bureaucrat by the legions. It was an issue that would bedevil his reign and may explain his decision to appoint Gaius Rufus as the senior consul in 97 AD, a highly respected veteran military commander whom some of the legions had tried to encourage to claim the imperial title back in 68 AD at the beginning of the civil war following Nero's downfall. While he had also held major military commands in Germania over the years, Rufus was also elderly. Nerva was hoping to win over sections of the army by associating his reign with Rufus's stellar military record. To compound his problems, the Roman treasury was in the midst of a crisis when Nerva became emperor. There had been several costly wars during Domitian's reign, notably an extensive campaign in Britain and against the Dacians in the Balkans, all of which had produced few tangible results but had been a costly expense. The size of the standing army had also continued to grow for decades without complementary fiscal reform to help pay for the enlarged establishment. Finally, there was a growing inequality in Rome and Italy itself and a crisis of poverty amongst the lower class. As a bureaucratic ruler, Nerva sought to tackle these issues, imposing new taxes on the wealthy elite to establish a welfare system known as the alimenta, which channeled money to orphans and the landless. There had been welfare measures in Rome for centuries in the shape of the grain dole, but Nerva expanded the system to alleviate the grinding poverty in which so many Romans lived despite the wider state's wealth and power. These measures did nothing to alleviate the financial pressure on the state. However, Nerva managed to pay for his new measures by ordering the tearing down of statues in Domitian's honor and having the gold and silver on them melted down to mint new coins, something which created a one-off financial windfall that helped pay for his welfare measures. One very notable element of Nerva's financial and administrative reforms concerns the Jewish subjects of the empire. As we have seen, a major revolt had been initiated by the Jews of Judea. All the way back in 66 AD, that same revolt had dragged on for the better part of a decade, the last embers of it only being snuffed out in 73 and 74 AD. Thereafter, the Flavians imposed a tax of 2 drachmas per head annually on every Jewish person of the empire, man, woman, or child. The fiscus Judaicus, or Jewish tax, was an onerous imposition levied on the basis that it was to be used to pay for the cost of suppressing the revolt. It was still being imposed a quarter of a century later. Nerva was the only emperor of the era who attempted to reverse the anti-Semitic policies of the Romans by ending the tax. Coins mined during his reign, presumably in Judea and other eastern provinces where the Jews lived in large numbers, acknowledged Nerva as abolishing what was termed the malicious prosecution of the Jewish tax. This approach was quickly reversed, and Nerva's successor, Trajan, would reimpose the fiscus Judaicus. It is notable that Nerva tried to intervene concerning what he deemed to be an unjust policy. He was right to do so on a practical level too, as with the fiscus Judaicus reimposed by Trajan, further massive Jewish rebellions would follow. There were other measures enacted by Nerva that steered more towards social reform. From Cassius Dio, we learn that he promulgated a law that prohibited any man from being made a eunuch. A eunuch in ancient times was an individual who was castrated. In some Oriental courts, such as those of the rulers of the Persian Empire between the 6th and 4th centuries BC, eunuchs became prominent as officials who were charged with managing the king's harem. Over time, they gained influence within government, and eunuchs remained a powerful group of individuals at the courts of many Eastern rulers over the centuries. As late as the early 20th century, in the case of the Ottoman Empire, the Romans generally looked down on the practice and equated it with the Oriental culture of their great Eastern enemy, the Parthians. There were nevertheless a growing number of eunuchs in the Roman Empire by the late 1st century, many being slaves exploited for sexual purposes, others being religious figures. Nerva was clearly unhappy with the development, and attempting to prohibit it was one of his pieces of social reform. Other Nerva legislation banned men from marrying their nieces, a measure which reversed a decree that had been passed back in 49 AD to allow Emperor Claudius to marry Agrippina, the daughter of his deceased brother, Germanicus. There is a sense here of a ruler determined to reimpose traditional Roman values in a society which he perceived to be in moral decline. Presumably, Nerva's efforts to prohibit the proliferation of eunuchs and uncles marrying their nieces would have had little impact on the lives of many Romans. The lives of the Eternal City's inhabitants would have been much more impacted by his decision to complete a building project which Domitian had started. This was a grand new imperial structure. In the city center, over a century earlier, Julius Caesar had laid out the first Roman Forum, a large public space of temples, markets, civic buildings, monuments, and colonnaded walkways. It was effectively a grand open area that served both as a civic amenity and as a piece of propaganda designed to promote the reputation of the builder. Augustus had imitated him, and Tiberius had also built a very small forum during his reign. Domitian had ordered construction of one early in his reign, and now Nerva completed and opened it in 97 AD. The Forum of Nerva is the smallest of the imperial fora in central Rome. Perhaps the most impressive building, when it stood in all its grandeur, was a temple of Minerva, which dominated the western end of the forum. This was in honor of the goddess of wisdom, music, and poetry, who was the direct Roman equivalent of Athena, for whom the Parthenon was built on the Acropolis of Athens half a millennium earlier. Elsewhere, there was a temple to the god Janus, a deity who had special significance in Rome, as the doors of a much older temple of Janus were symbolically opened and closed depending on whether the Roman state was at war at a given time or not. The Forum of Nerva was not the only public works program that Nerva was responsible for furthering during his brief time as emperor. One of the great achievements of the Romans was the infrastructure they developed across their empire, notably the roads and the aqueducts that supplied water to their cities and towns. To expand the system and make repairs, Nerva appointed a military engineer nearby by the name of Sextus Julius Frontinus, a veteran of the wars in Britain and a former consul, as curator aquarum, overseer of the aqueducts. Frontinus was an energetic officer who ordered the officials working under him to begin producing a series of maps of the aqueduct system across the empire and identifying areas where repairs needed to be made. Efficiently, Frontinus would continue in the office beyond Nerva's reign. At the same time, he began work on a treatise entitled De Aqueductu on Aqueducts, which has survived down to the present day and acted as a model for municipal governments when it came to developing urban water supply systems as late as the 18th and 19th centuries. It would be remiss not to consider Nerva's foreign policy, as limited in scope as it was. He did not engage in any wars, which was hardly surprising given that the emperor did not have any background as a military commander. He might have chosen to do so if he wished, as there were border issues when he assumed the imperial office, notably in the Balkans, where Domitian had been embroiled in several wars with the Dacians, whose kingdom would be conquered in the first years of the following reign. Equally, in Britain, he was at least partially responsible for cementing the policy of consolidating the Roman position around the river Humber. Early in Domitian's reign, a campaign had been undertaken into Scotland against the Caledonians. A new emperor could well have attempted to conquer the rest of Britain. Nerva didn't, and his successors would broadly follow his lead, building defensive walls across northern England and southern Scotland rather than attempting to proceed into the economically and strategically valueless Scottish Highlands. There were stirrings elsewhere, with tribes such as the Sway and Quadi rumbling around the border area in Germania and the land corridor that separated it from the river Danube. Trouble would begin to emerge here decades later, something which Nerva made some preparations for by ordering the strengthening of the Limes Germanicus, the name for the massive northern border which stretched from the North Sea along the river Rhine and through Central Europe to the Danube and the Balkans. The issue of the succession had emerged immediately once Nerva became emperor. Depending on whether Cassius Dio or Aurelius Victor's account is correct, Nerva was either 66 or 61 years of age when he was elected as emperor by the Senate in the early winter of 96. Life expectancies were relatively high for the Roman elite in imperial times. Once a person survived the hazards of infancy and childhood, it was not uncommon for a person of Nerva's social status to reach their late 60s or even live into their 70s. However, people living beyond 75 years was rare. Hence, if Dio's account is correct, and most historians tend to trust him over Aurelius Victor, Nerva was not expected to live for many more years when he became emperor. Moreover, he was childless and would have to choose a successor. It was probable Nerva's first choice was Marcus Cornelius Maternus, an experienced political figure who had served as consul on several occasions, was a member of the Senate, and had governed numerous provinces. Since the short reign of Titus, at the time of Nerva's accession, he was the governor of the wealthy province of Syria and was stationed along the eastern border with a large army. His experience and military record would have recommended Maternus to Nerva. A contemporary of these events, Pliny the Younger, later wrote that a powerful eastern commander was initially being prepared by Nerva to succeed him, a reference almost certainly to Maternus. While Maternus might have been a judicious choice, he wasn't favored by those that mattered, the heads of the Praetorian Guard and the other legion commanders along the northern frontier in Germania. More than any other political grouping in the history of imperial Rome, it was the Praetorians and the commanders of the legions stationed along the rivers Rhine and Danube that decided who became emperor and who didn't. In this particular case, they seemed to favor a different candidate. His name was Marcus Opus Trajanus, a member of a well-regarded Roman family that had colonized part of Hispania 3 centuries earlier. All previous emperors had hailed from Italy, however. Trajan was a very well-liked man. military commander, and at the time of Nerva, Axis was one of the most senior army commanders on the Rhine border in Germania. Over time, it became apparent to many that Trajan was a more esteemed potential successor than Maternus. There is nothing to indicate that Nerva was opposed to Trajan's candidacy, simply that he was more inclined to pick Maternus. His hand was forced, though, in the course of 97 AD. Early that year, just a few months into his reign, Nerva faced a quasi-revolt amongst the Praetorian Guards, the imperial bodyguards who were the only force allowed in Rome and Italy, and which, as we have seen, had become a political force in their own right, murdering Caligula back in Nerva's childhood days and placing Claudius on the throne. Now, at the beginning of Nerva's reign, the prefect or commander of the guard, Gaius Iulius, refused to obey Nerva's orders and effectively laid siege to the imperial palace, demanding that Nerva take a more militant approach to prosecuting those who had been closest to Domitian. Nerva's regime was exposed as being weak through these actions, and in the end, he was forced to placate Gaius and the Praetorians. He did so by prosecuting several of Domitian's former closest allies. He also determined on a new succession policy. In the summer of 97 AD, word arrived on the Rhine frontier to Trajan that Nerva had adopted him as his successor. With this, the military standoff in Rome ended, and the succession issue was resolved. Historians have debated the nature of the regime thereafter. Some hold that Nerva remained in position as emperor, but there was now effectively a period of dual administration with Trajan ruling in association with Nerva from Germania. Back in Rome, Nerva spent the next few months having some of Domitian's former officials and government figures hunted down and killed, despite the ambiguities involved, whereby some of those now murdered were individuals who had taken part in the conspiracy which led to Domitian's assassination. Otherwise, beyond overseeing the implementation of some of the existing policies and carrying out more formal duties such as the opening of the Forum of Nerva, the emperor seems to have entered a semi-retirement after arranging for Trajan to succeed him. Cassius Dio presents this as the enlightened policy of a ruler who had settled on a successor of much ability and who now felt confident enough to ease his workload, sure that the state would be in capable hands going forward. Dio's account may be a bit fanciful. In reality, Nerva possibly lightened his workload owing to ill health. On the 1st of January, 98 AD, he suffered a stroke from which he never really recovered. 4 weeks later, on the 27th of January, he died while convalescing at the Gardens of Sallust, a villa and gardens developed by an earlier Roman politician and historian in the northeast of the city. Aurelius Victor tells us that on the day that Nerva died, there was a solar eclipse. He was buried in the mausoleum of Augustus, the early imperial tomb. On the Campus Martius in the city center, in keeping with a well-established tradition for Roman emperors, he was deified almost immediately afterwards. The Roman historian and senator Tacitus, one of the ancient world's great historians, was finishing his account of the life of his father-in-law, Gnaeus Julius Agricola, the former highly successful governor of Britain, right around the time of Nerva's death. In that book, he described the emperor, who had reigned for less than a year and a half, in glowing terms as a ruler who blended things once irreconcilable, sovereignty and freedom. Nerva's death could well have ushered in a new civil war, in the vein of that which was seen back in the year of the 4 emperors, though it didn't. News was quickly conveyed north to Trajan on the Rhine border in Germania. He seems to have been quietly confident that he wouldn't be challenged by any other rival, as he did not rush southwards to Rome to seize power as quickly as possible. Instead, he spent months progressing around the northern provinces, perhaps assuring the large number of legions here along the frontier that he would show them greater favor than the pacifist Nerva had. And that is exactly what happened. Having finally arrived in Rome and taken full charge of the government there in 99 AD, Trajan embarked on a series of wars in the Balkans and in the east against Rome's greatest enemy, the Parthian Empire. He expanded the Roman Empire to its greatest extent by the end of his reign. He would be a different emperor to Nerva, one who stressed the concept of imperium rather than the more conciliatory princeps. Trajan's accession and the manner in which it had been arranged by Nerva to appoint someone to succeed him who was not a close family relative, but who was instead a capable politician and military commander, would be replicated to a substantial degree for decades to come. Trajan would never settle fully on a successor, but he did show favor to a great-nephew by the name of Hadrian. The pair did not have an immensely warm relationship, yet the promotion of him to a position where he could one day succeed Trajan was wise. Hadrian turned out to be an immensely talented administrator, a ruler who secured the borders and engaged in wide-ranging judicial, administrative, and economic reforms. His successor, Antoninus Pius, and the emperor after that, Marcus Aurelius, were each successful in their own ways, despite a brutal plague epidemic ravaging the empire in the middle of the 2nd century. Owing to all of this, the period between Nerva's accession in 96 AD and the end of Marcus Aurelius's reign over 80 years later has become known as the reigns of the 5 good emperors. Beyond perhaps the long reign of Augustus, it was the most successful and prosperous period in the history of the Roman Empire. In laying the groundwork for it during his brief reign, Nerva secured for himself a reputation as one of Rome's better emperors, despite the brevity of his rule and the opposition he faced. Nerva was one of Rome's most peculiar emperors, ruling between the creation of the Principate by Caesar Augustus and the end of the Severan dynasty, which marked the onset of the 3rd century crisis in 235 AD. During this period of nearly 3 centuries, he is the emperor about whom we know the least. The details of his early life, both as a child and in his 20s and early 30s, are almost entirely unknown, other than his family background. He only begins to emerge in the mid-60s AD when he played a role in uncovering the Pisonian conspiracy. For the next 3 decades, we know he was on the periphery of Rome's politics, always seemingly close to those in power, though why and what functions he performed is a mystery. This is particularly so since he did not perform any of the traditional roles of a powerful Roman political figure, such as becoming a governor of a province or taking part in some military campaign. Despite all of this, when a combination of the imperial staff, the Senate, and the Praetorian Guard decided to dispense with Domitian and the Flavian dynasty in 96 AD, it was an obscure senator that they elected to become the new ruler of Rome. His reign was short, though we shouldn't trivialize his achievements in combating the fiscal crisis, trying to adopt a more tolerant policy towards the empire's Jewish community, completing a new forum in Rome, and initiating a series of civil reforms. Barring the unlikely discovery of some long-lost source from the ancient world, we will never know the full contours of Nerva's life and reign. Yet his time as emperor was an important watershed in the early history of the empire. What do you think of Emperor Nerva? Was he only ever intended to be an interim emperor while a more permanent successor to the Flavian dynasty was found? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. The man known to history as Walt Disney was born on the 5th of December, 1901 in the Hermosa district of the city of Chicago in Illinois in the United States. His father was Elias Disney, the son of Irish immigrants who had first settled in Ontario in British Canada in the early 19th century. Elias's family had moved to California in the 1870s in a belated attempt to profit from the state's gold rush. They soon abandoned that plan and accepted an offer to become farmers in Kansas. There, young Elias attempted to work as an orange farmer for a time, but this endeavor failed, and he was soon on the move again, working numerous jobs through the late 1880s and 1890s, notably on the railways. Eventually, he settled in Chicago and became a building contractor there. Walt's mother was Flora Call, a woman of English and German heritage. She had been a student at a school in Kansas where Elias had briefly filled in as a teacher for his sister. They quickly started a relationship and were married in 1888. They would have 5 children altogether, of which Walt was the 4th. The eldest was Herbert, born in 1888, followed by Raymond in 1890, and then Roy in 1893. It was a long gap before Walt was born in 1901, and then a daughter, Ruth, finally arrived in 1903. The Disney family continued to move frequently during Walt's youth. In the mid-1900s, a neighbor living near them on Tripp Avenue in Chicago had his barn broken into and robbed, following which Elias, a pious, conservative Christian, decided he did not want his family growing up in a city where criminality was so common. They moved to a 40-acre farm outside the town of Marceline in the state of Missouri, where one of Elias's brothers already lived. There, they grew fruit and cereal crops, but it was a tough life, and Walt's older brothers, Herbert and Raymond, soon left and headed to Chicago looking for work. In 1911, the family moved again, this time to Kansas City, where Elias had acquired the delivery rights to the local newspaper, the Kansas City Star. Walt and his brother Roy consequently spent the years that followed getting up shortly after 4 a.m. to begin the newspaper delivery runs before heading to school for a long day. Walt's grades suffered both from this itinerant youth and the manner in which work distracted him from his schooling. He had developed a liking for drawing, though, and was soon attracted to producing cartoons and cartoon-like characters. It would be the making of him in the long run. Disney was growing up during a period when the very nature of popular entertainment and children's entertainment was changing profoundly. Throughout history, there have been forms of entertainment that are spectator endeavors. A small group of people perform in some way, and a larger group of people watch and are entertained by what they see. This had always been a live-action form of entertainment, whether it was dramas or comedies being performed in theaters or circuses moving from town to entertain people within them. One of the most famous shows of all at the turn of the century was Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. But things were changing during Disney's youth. From the middle of the 19th century onwards, rapid advances were made in how to record images and how to transform these into videos and films. The Hollywood region north of Los Angeles in California would soon become the home of many of the first film studios, for the simple reason that natural sunlight was the best way to expose film at the time, and California had plenty of it along with pleasant living conditions. It was also around this time that video pioneers began to come up with the idea that the much older medium of cartoons, whereby drawings telling a story were produced in sequences, something which had begun to proliferate in newspapers since the middle of the 18th century, could be adapted to produce animation videos, whereby hundreds of drawings were utilized to create a video narrative by moving rapidly from picture to picture. The first major example of a hand-drawn animation film appeared in 1908, Phantasmagorie, by the French cartoonist, Émile Cohl. Disney was only 6 years old at the time, but the new medium would have a profound impact on his life and the history of popular culture in 20th century America. In 1917, the Disney family moved yet again. Back in the 1890s, when they had first lived in Chicago, Elias had purchased some shares in the Ozell Company, an outfit that produced apple juice and jelly in cans. In the intervening period, the company had done okay, and by the mid-1910s, Elias's shares became significant enough that he was able to acquire a place on the board of the company and move the family back to Chicago. Back in the Windy City, Walt acquired a position as a cartoonist with the school newspaper at McKinley High School. He was anxious to leave Chicago, though. The United States had just entered the First World War, and Walt wanted to sign up for the military. However, turning just 16 years old in December 1917, he was considered too young. Eventually, he forged his date of birth on a birth certificate in order to acquire a posting with the Red Cross in France, but when he arrived in Europe in November 1918, he learned that the war had just ended. He returned home in 1919 after a stint in Europe that had seen him continue his interest in drawing by producing cartoons for the U.S. Army newspaper, The Stars and Stripes. Walt soon acquired a job working as a drawer for an advertising company in Kansas City, where he had lived during some of his most formative years between 1911 and 1917. It was while he was working in Kansas at the end of the 1910s that Disney formed what would be the most important relationship in his entire life. In the art department at the Pesman Rubin Commercial Art Studio, he met a fellow drawer and cartoonist by the name of Ub Ert Iwerks, a son of German immigrants who was just a few months older than Walt. Ub, who eventually shortened his name to simply Ub Iwerks, had a tough upbringing, having been abandoned by his father when he was very young. He and Walt soon bonded over their love of drawing, and the pair became fast friends. They also soon decided to leave the Pesman Rubin studio and strike out on their own, founding their own art studio while continuing to do occasional work for outfits like the Kansas City Slide newspaper company. Disney's later success would be considerably owing to Iwerks' talent. For instance, early on in their work together as animators, Iwerks developed a method of attaching a motor to an animation camera, which simplified the manner in which still images were rapidly flipped through to produce animation footage, while Iwerks would also be responsible to a considerable extent for designing the character of Mickey Mouse. This is not to take anything away from Walt's role. He was the driving force behind the creation of the company that bears his name. It was Disney who started numerous companies in Kansas along with Iwerks and managed the business side of them, and it was Walt who also took the decision in the summer of 1923 to head out west to California to found an animation studio in Hollywood, which had been firmly established by the mid-1920s as the heart of the burgeoning U.S. film industry. His initial reasons for doing so were twofold. His older brother Roy had moved out to the Golden State a while earlier, where he hoped that the warmer climate might aid his health problems, having been diagnosed with a mild case of tuberculosis. There, Walt and Roy soon set up the Disney Brothers studio and began working on producing animated pictures. Though it was a dual enterprise to begin with, ultimately Walt was the one with animation experience and was the leader of the business. Therefore, before long it was renamed as the Walt Disney Company. He was soon in touch with Iwerks too, and he convinced him to come out west to join him in Hollywood, something which the Kansas animator quickly agreed to. The company stayed afloat early on by producing the Alice comedies, a series of short films that interspersed live-action footage with cartoon animations. It would not be long before Disney and iWorks began work on a much more famous character. Disney had arrived in Hollywood at a time of immense change in the film industry. Film studios proliferated here from the mid-1910s onwards as pioneers of the medium sought warm climates that were conducive to exposing filming scenes, and avoiding interference from the great inventor Thomas Edison, who had a patent on his film production techniques, giving him a virtual monopoly on the East Coast. In these early days, motion pictures were silent films, though soon innovators began to introduce music and sound effects into their productions once technological developments allowed them to do so. It was no major leap of the imagination from there to introduce dialogue into films once it too became possible, and in 1927, a few years after Disney arrived in California, the first film appeared which used synchronized speech and singing. Thus were born the talkies, the name used at the time for films which employed the new technology. In the 1930s, the talkies would become the standard form of film being produced in Hollywood. Animated films of the kind Disney was interested in producing would follow this general trajectory, with the films of the 1920s introducing innovations in terms of visual images and sound techniques, but dialogue only becoming a standard feature in the 1930s. Disney films would be no different in this respect. What would mark them as distinct was their success. Walt's personal life changed during these years. In 1923, Lillian Bounds, a woman from Idaho 3 years Disney senior, had moved out to California to find work. She soon took a position working as a secretary at the nascent Disney Studios. She and Walt began a relationship, and on the 13th of July, 1925, they were married back home in her native Idaho. It was Lillian who suggested the name Mickey Mouse to Walt for a character he and iWorks were devising in 1928. After he informed her on a train journey across the country from New York to California that he was considering the name Mortimer Mouse, their marriage was a complex one. They struggled to have children, something which led to Walt having a borderline nervous breakdown in 1931. He recovered, and they eventually managed to have a daughter, Diane, in December 1933 after Lillian suffered several miscarriages. A second child eluded them, and in 1936 they adopted another daughter named Sharon when she was just a few weeks old. To the outside world, she was their biological daughter. It was not always an idyllic family life. Walt was a distant figure, often retreating to a room in their mansion where he had an enormous toy train installed, one which managed to run round and round a track that was nearly half a mile long. This aside, Disney could be sentimental. Years later at Disneyland, he had the Lily Bell train car installed as a homage to the role his wife played in conceiving Mickey Mouse. Work on what would eventually become Mickey Mouse began in 1927. Disney and iWorks had finished up work on the Alice comedies that had provided the core of their income in the first years of the studio's existence and needed a new project and new sources of income. Disney was advised by Charles Mintz, the head of another studio, Winkler Pictures, that Universal Pictures, one of the oldest studios in the country, wanted to set up a cartoon division and were looking for a character to launch this. Initially, Disney and iWorks thought that they might use a character based on a cat, but they quickly concluded that this had been overused already in other animations. They then landed on the idea of a rabbit character. The result, after a few weeks of work, was the birth of Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, a black and white walking rabbit who was a prototype for what became Mickey Mouse before long. After a short film starring Oswald entitled Poor Papa was rejected by Universal, Disney worked to produce a second one called Trolley Troubles. Universal was pleased and ordered more. Eventually, 27 short films featuring Oswald would be produced, netting Disney a handsome income from Universal, which placed the young studio on a decent financial footing. By then, the studio's staff had swelled to 20 people, while Walt, Roy Disney, and iWorks proved themselves to be good businesspeople. The Disneys invested some of the profit in an oil drilling business. iWorks used his proceeds to build up a side business producing and selling inks and paints used by animators and cartoonists like himself. Oswald the Lucky Rabbit was an inspiration for what would become Disney's most iconic character. Early in 1928, Disney and his wife visited New York, where Walt had a meeting to try and negotiate a more favorable cut of the profits for producing further films featuring Oswald over the next 2 years. He was disappointed by the offer he was made, and so on the train back to California, he began devising a new character, one which Winkler Pictures and Universal would not have commercial rights to in the way they now did to Oswald. Disney hit on the idea of creating a character like Oswald but slightly different. A mouse character could retain some of the anatomical features of Oswald and get around any copyright issues. As noted, he initially planned on calling the mouse version of Oswald Mortimer Mouse, but Lillian quickly convinced him that Mickey Mouse would sound better. Once he was back in California, iWorks drew Mickey Mouse as we largely know him today. His role in the creation of the character should be acknowledged, though the idea was Disney's. Disney and iWorks began work on an animated short film featuring Mickey immediately thereafter. The first outing was actually a production called Plain Crazy, in which both Mickey and Minnie Mouse appeared. However, it did not perform well at a test screening, and they went back to the drawing board, literally in this case. The result was Steamboat Willie, widely considered the debut of Mickey Mouse and also one of the first animated films to use fully synchronized sound to match the cartoon. Steamboat ran to just under 8 minutes. It begins with Mickey as a paddle steamboat pilot and revolves around his ongoing clashes with Captain Pete, a much larger cat-like character. Minnie Mouse races to catch the boat at one juncture, and Mickey helps her to board it. Pete eventually punishes Mickey by making him peel a load of potatoes. There is music and sounds of a kind issued by the characters throughout, though no real dialogue to speak of beyond some spoken by a parrot. With a budget of nearly $5,000, the audience response at the test screening was very positive, and Steamboat Willie was released. It premiered in New York in November 1928 and was soon more widely screened to critical acclaim and commercial success. Mickey would go on to become the most iconic of Disney characters. 12 short films were released featuring him alone in 1929, and the pattern continued into the 1930s as the studio sought to capitalize on his popularity. When merchandise, licensing rights, and all other commercial factors are taken into account, it is estimated that Mickey Mouse has earned Disney almost $200 billion over nearly a century since 1928. In 1929, Disney began working on a new range of animated shorts known as the Silly Symphony cartoons. These were originally conceived as short and funny animated videos that would accompany individual songs. However, before long, they were expanded into longer versions. Some 75 Silly Symphony films would be produced by Disney in the decade between 1929 and 1939. One above all others stands out, Three Little Pigs, which Disney released in 1933. Notably, in this case, Disney did not produce original characters. Indeed, iWorks had left Disney altogether and gone out to work on his own in 1930 after a falling out between him and Walt. Disney was not an easy man to get along with, and his brusque attitude towards iWorks as an employee, despite the fact that UB was clearly integral to the early success of Disney, had led to a rift. Instead of using characters which iWorks had helped create, The Three Little Pigs was based on a fable dating back to at least the middle of the 19th century. It was part of a new pattern whereby Disney would draw on old fairy tales and folklore for material, reimagining tales from the medieval and early modern eras in new ways suitable for children. Three Little Pigs cost $22,000 to make, but it grossed approximately $250,000 and won the Academy Award in 1934 for Best Animated Short Film. With the success of The Three Little Pigs and other short films produced by Disney in the late 1920s and early 1930s, Walt began to conceive of a project to produce a feature-length animated film for the first time. He began sounding out the idea to other senior staff members and then looked for a story that could form the basis for the project. Proposals included making an animated children's version of one of Homer's ancient Greek stories, the Iliad and the Odyssey, or Jonathan Swift's book, Gulliver's Travels. Disney, though, eventually settled on a film version of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, a story which first appeared in its modern form in the first volume of collected fairy tales published by the Brothers Grimm in Germany in 1812, but which drew on earlier folk tales from Central Europe. A live-action silent film adaptation of the story had already been released in 1916. Disney now decided on an animated version. In preparation for its release during the Christmas holidays in 1937, Disney himself appeared in a trailer in which he introduced the characters of the Seven Dwarfs. When it was released, it became an enormous success, grossing over $8 million by the end of 1938, a sum which made it the most financially successful animated film, adjusting for inflation, until the release of Aladdin in 1993. Disney was awarded an honorary Oscar by the Academy of Motion Pictures in 1939 for the film, with the Academy stating that the award was bestowed in recognition of Snow White constituting, quote, a significant screen innovation which has charmed millions and pioneered a great new entertainment field for the motion picture cartoon. Walt would follow up the success of Snow White by next adapting Carlo Collodi's 1883 children's novel, The Adventures of Pinocchio, for the screen. Released in 1940 simply as Pinocchio, the story is relatively well known. However, Disney adapted the original quite significantly. The story is written by the pseudonymous Carlo Collodi, a pen name adopted by Carlo Lorenzini, is a satire of European society in the second half of the 19th century and the perils of industrialization. Pinocchio is also not a very nice character in it. For instance, in the original, Pinocchio kills the character of Jiminy Cricket early on in the story by throwing a hammer at him. Geppetto, the kindly carpenter who fashions Pinocchio out of wood, is a much more put-upon character, one who is immediately kicked by the puppet when he comes to life. He later sells his only coat to buy Pinocchio some schoolbooks, only for Pinocchio to sell these on his way to school, which he does not attend. Disney sanitized the story, making it much more family-friendly. Jiminy Cricket becomes Pinocchio's friend, for instance, rather than a character that briefly appears at the start and is murdered by Pinocchio. Lorenzini's message was completely lost in Disney's rendering, but the film was a critical success, becoming the first animated film to win Academy Awards, in this instance in the music categories. It did not perform that well commercially, though, in large part because the Second World War had broken out in Europe by then, and while the US was still neutral, the economic impact was being felt in America immediately. There were some questionable decisions made by Disney during these years leading up to and during the Second World War that erupted in Europe in 1939. In December 1938, a party of Germans, which included the notorious director Leni Riefenstahl, was allowed into Disney Studios and given a tour of the facilities. She was the director of both Triumph of the Will and Olympia, two films which appeared in 1935 and 1938, showing the Nazi rallies at Nuremberg and other Nazi events. They were clearly propaganda pieces for the regime, though the extent to which Riefenstahl was a committed Nazi or simply a film director pursuing her craft through the established regime in Germany has been debated ever since. Her visit to Disney occurred just a few weeks after international newspapers had been filled with reports about the Kristallnacht, the Night of the Broken Glass, when thousands of Jewish homes, businesses, and synagogues had been attacked throughout Germany and Austria on the orders of the Nazi regime on the night of the 9th of November, 1938. Riefenstahl's tour of the Disney facilities was controversial even when news of it got around in December 1938. The company released a statement claiming that they had been unaware that she would form part of the German party and would not have admitted her had they known so. Others have theorized since that Walt knew very well about her visit and had facilitated it because he wanted to meet with Riefenstahl, both to try and get her to facilitate the wider distribution of Disney films in Europe and over a large debt he was owed by the German distributor of Disney films. This was not the only questionable action of Disney's which has opened him up to accusations of anti-Semitism, but his racial views do remain contested to this day, and it is entirely possible that he was simply unaware of who Riefenstahl was or why her visit might have been controversial. The possibility that the Riefenstahl visit was simply an oversight is strengthened when we consider the turmoil in Disney's personal life right around this time. Less than 2 weeks before the German director visited Disney Studios, his mother Flora was killed by an incident of carbon monoxide poisoning on the 26th of November, 1938. This happened in a home in North Hollywood that Walt and his brother Roy had purchased for their mother and father. They had complained of a faulty furnace some time beforehand, but people were far less aware of the dangers of the odorless carbon monoxide a century ago. Elias Disney was in bad shape after the incident as well, though he recovered and lived for another 3 years, dying at 82 years of age in 1941. He and Walt fell out after Flora's death, Elias possibly blaming his son for the incident. When he received news of his father's death, Walt was on a business trip. He refused to cut it short and consequently missed the funeral. The death of his mother at 70 years of age, and under circumstances in which Disney seems to have partially blamed himself for buying them the house where Flora was killed not long afterwards, impacted badly on him. Those who knew him personally commented later on a harder edge to Disney after the incident, while it has also been suggested that the lack of female, mother-like figures in many Disney productions of the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s reflects some unresolved issues in Walt concerning his own mother's passing. As noted, the Nazis were becoming increasingly inflammatory in their behavior in Europe by 1938. In 1939, this came to a head following the German invasion of Poland when Britain and France declared war. The United States did not immediately enter the Second World War, though President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was committed to providing Britain with as much aid while remaining as neutral as possible. It was not until the attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii by Germany's ally, the Empire of Japan, that the U.S. entered the conflict directly in December 1941. These years created some business difficulties for Disney. While the U.S. was not a direct participant in the conflict for over 2 years after it began, the disruption to the world economy forced the U.S. government to tighten its belt fiscally. This had an impact on ordinary cinemagoers, and this impacted Disney's bottom line. The European market was completely devastated as well. What compounded matters was that Disney Studios was set for an over-the-counter share sale in March 1940, a precursor to the wider IPO and stock market floating of the company in 1957. In advance of the over-the-counter share sale in 1940, Disney introduced a wide range of labor reforms at the company to reduce expenses. Staff were not happy. Many were made to sign documents saying they were working 40-hour weeks, when in reality they were working significantly longer hours, while they were also annoyed by the lack of credit they were receiving for their animation work. Pay was poor at Disney for the rank-and-file staff as well. This all boiled over in May 1941 into the Disney animators' strike, one which would last for 4 months. Disney initially tried a heavy-handed approach to solving this, but eventually, against his own inclinations, he had to improve working standards and allow staff to unionize. One boon to the Disney business during this period was the return of Iwerks. He and Walt reconciled in 1940, and he would work on numerous prominent projects with the studio again over the next quarter of a century. The years of U.S. neutrality in the war between 1939 and 1941 also saw Disney release a landmark film, the one which performed poorly from a commercial perspective under the wartime circumstances, at least initially. This was the 1940 release of Fantasia. The concept for this was a fairly highbrow one for Disney. It was based on the poem, The Sorcerer's Apprentice, by the great German writer, poet, playwright, and general polymath, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, written in 1797. This was originally conceived as a short under the name The Sorcerer's Apprentice, one which would feature as part of the Silly Symphony series. With production costs soaring for it, Walt decided it needed to become a feature film to recoup the expenses. Thus was born Fantasia. The film would feature Mickey Mouse as the Sorcerer's Apprentice and was essentially an animated opera, one in which classical compositions by composers like Johann Sebastian Bach, Igor Stravinsky, and Ludwig van Beethoven were performed by Leopold Stokowski and the Philadelphia Orchestra. Running to around 2 hours, Fantasia is now considered a masterpiece of early animated film. Stokowski was awarded an honorary Academy Award for the soundtrack, and Disney for the film for the unique blending of classical music with the work of Goethe, all through the prism of Mickey Mouse. The limited commercial success of Fantasia, despite its critical acclaim, and the difficulties with his staff that Disney encountered in 1940 and 1941 made it clear to Walt that he would need to change course to some extent amidst wartime conditions, especially so after the U.S. entered the conflict directly. Indeed, the situation was quite drastic. Fantasia had cost $2.3 million to make, and other expenditures were rising after the strike. Disney consequently decided to take on a raft of government contracts during the war. Within weeks of the attack on Pearl Harbor, Disney Studios were hosting hundreds of American Marines who needed to be stationed in the Burbank region to protect a Lockheed aircraft manufacturing facility nearby that the government feared could be a target if the Japanese launched further surprise attacks on the West Coast. More importantly, Disney negotiated large contracts with the government to produce both educational films for cadets to watch during their few months of training before being sent to North Africa, Europe, or the Pacific in 1942, while there would also be animated films that would champion the war cause. For the latter, Disney transformed Donald Duck, a character who had first appeared in a Silly Symphony film back in 1934, into the wartime face of Disney. He appeared in a great many films between 1942 and 1945. A good example is Der Führer's Face, a cartoon in which Donald is a line worker in a factory producing war munitions in Naziland. He is tormented by long hours working for the wartime economy, poor rations, and having to spend much of his day giving salutes to images of Der Führer's face, which sometimes appear for no reason on the assembly lines. The short was one of two war propaganda films, the other being the Yankee Doodle Mouse starring Tom and Jerry, which won Academy Awards for animated short films during the Second World War. Donald Duck cartoons and other related work designed to boost American morale at home while the soldiers fought abroad kept Disney afloat financially during the war. Nevertheless, Walt was still concerned to finish a number of films that had already been in production before the war. One such was Dumbo, the tale of a put-upon elephant called Jumbo J.N.R., who is mockingly referred to as Dumbo on account of his large ears. Dumbo has the last laugh, though, as he learns to fly using his oversized ears. The film had been in pre-production as early as 1939. Disney decided to finish it after the commercial failure of Fantasia, while also scaling it back to cut costs, meaning that the final film was just 64 minutes long when released in 1941. It was followed a year later by Bambi, the story of a white-tailed deer named Bambi who meets with adversity. It was based on a novel written by Felix Salten, a Jewish Austrian, and published in 1923. Though the film has always been held in high regard, critics have since pointed out that Disney basically excised the meaning of Salten's novel from the film, the book being an allegorical statement about the dangers Europe's Jews faced in an increasingly anti-Semitic Europe. It has added to the thorny issue of Disney's alleged anti-Semitism and is also one of the foremost examples of how Disney sanitized and dumbed down 20th century culture in order to create mere entertainment. Donald Duck would soon be able to stop saluting the Führer's likeness and get a break from the assembly line. The Second World War came to an end in Europe at the beginning of May 1945, and the Japanese surrendered 4 months later after 2 nuclear weapons were dropped on their country. Once the war came to an end, Disney had to negotiate relief from the Bank of America, as the studio was now carrying millions of dollars worth of debt. An arrangement was reached in large part because the bank knew that Disney was a solid business that simply needed time to recover from the setbacks it had experienced during the Great Depression of the 1930s and then the war years. A comparative lull followed in Disney's output as Walt and Roy focused on producing a number of live-action nature documentaries and other features of that kind, which were cheap to make and that could turn a decent profit. Consequently, it was the early 1950s before they would return to animated feature films, but when they did, a slew of hits followed, namely Cinderella, Alice in Wonderland, and Peter Pan, all of which premiered between 1950 and 1953. The decade between 1945 and 1955 was critical in establishing the future success of the Disney brand from a financial perspective. It also made Walt a very wealthy man himself. As the studios and related businesses went from strength to strength, he amassed a fortune. When he died, he would be worth around $100 million, making him a billionaire in modern terms. He didn't get there, though, by being an entirely likable character. Disney could be distant and unemotional with those around him, his wife and children included. A workaholic, he was not an easy person to toil under. Walt was notoriously short on praise and had extremely high standards. Those who worked extensively with him in the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s later stated that the best indication that Disney was happy with work was if he didn't criticize it. There was rarely ever praise. If he liked something, he would simply remark, "That works," or something to that effect. However, he was loyal towards talented staff, giving them decent bonuses in later years when the company got back on its feet financially. But his personal interactions were often very poor. He had a temper that staff saw regularly, and his attitude towards his brother, Roy, who had helped so much in financing the studio to get started back in the 1920s, was appalling on occasions, effectively referring to Roy as the company accountant rather than one of the directors. These were also years in which Disney played a role in the Red Scare and the Hollywood blacklist. No sooner had the Second World War ended in Europe than the Cold War began to develop as both the Western Allies and the Soviets claimed control over different parts of liberated Europe. At home in America in the late 1940s and the 1950s, life would be characterized by an increasing paranoia about a possible Soviet fifth column developing in the country. Many government officials and politicians were particularly suspicious about Hollywood, a place with a strong strain of left-wing politics and where some people were indeed favorably disposed to communism. Soon quasi-legitimate fears turned to panic and baseless accusations. Disney was amongst those leveling the accusations. As early as 1941, he published a piece in Variety magazine in which he had blamed the Disney animators' strike of 1941 on communist activity. In 1944, he was a founder of the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals, established to make sure Hollywood steered clear of allowing subtle communist messaging to enter its films. In 1947, when the House Un-American Activities Committee began convening hearings concerning Hollywood, Disney appeared alongside a still quite young Ronald Reagan and denounced many colleagues as being potential communists. Disney was also a special agent for the FBI during the late 1940s and early 1950s, though the exact nature of his role remains debated, with evidence pointing towards this largely being for him to produce educational films. The post-war era was different for Disney in more benign ways than the intricacies of the Cold War. When Disney Studios had first opened in the 1920s, people watched films and animated shorts in theaters or Odeons. The technology that would underpin televisions was only just then being developed by figures like the Scottish inventor, John Logie Baird. A television set he designed was made commercially available in the 1930s, but even so, it was only really in the aftermath of the Second World War that television started entering the homes of Americans in large numbers, and it was the 1950s before it became possible to transmit television signals nationally around the U.S. Disney was a quick adopter of the new technology. In 1955, the Mickey Mouse Club was launched with the iconic Mouseketeers. It ran initially until 1959 and would be revived in the 1970s. Many people will be familiar with it for facilitating the subsequent musical careers of Mouseketeers like Britney Spears and Justin Timberlake and actors like Ryan Gosling, but the greater significance in the short run was that Disney now plugged into the opportunities presented by television. The Disney Channel would launch several years later in 1983. In the first half of the 1950s, much of Disney's energies were consumed by one of his greatest endeavors. As far back as the early 1940s, he had developed an idea for creating a space where adults and their children could go and effectively play together in a way that moved beyond the traditional city or town park. The idea grew as he received regular letters over the years from individuals inquiring if they could come and visit the Disney studios at Burbank in California. Realizing that it was not practical for visitors to start coming to the studios in large numbers, he formulated a plan to build a kind of park that would be Disney-themed. At first, he intended to build this alongside the Burbank studios, but he soon realized that a much larger space was necessary to make his vision a reality. Thus, he purchased a 160-acre undeveloped plot of land near Anaheim in Orange County, California. There he began building the first Disneyland theme park in 1954. It opened for business in the summer of 1955, with the Sleeping Beauty Castle, based on the spectacular 19th-century Neuschwanstein Castle in southern Germany, being the centerpiece. Despite a disastrous opening day, when the asphalt melted in high heat, Disneyland was a major success. When the leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, visited the U.S. on an extended state visit in 1959, one of his few requests was that he wanted to visit the Californian theme park, a request that remained unfulfilled as security issues could not be resolved. The premier was not happy. During an angry outburst when he was informed of the decision, he stated, "For me, the situation is inconceivable. I cannot find words to explain this to my people." Walt might have been distracted with the opening and initial management of Disneyland for much of the 1950s, yet this did not stop the film studios from releasing a slew of successful and iconic films. 1955 saw The Lady and the Tramp entering theaters. In a shift from Disney's usual repertoire, it was based on a story that had only appeared in print in 1945, written by Ward Green and published in Cosmopolitan magazine as Happy Dan, the Cynical Dog. The film followed Lady, a Cocker Spaniel, as she grows up in the household of an affluent family and then falls for a rough-around-the-edges homeless dog, the tramp of the title. 4 years later, it was back to a much older story when Disney adapted Sleeping Beauty, a fairy tale written back in 1697 by the French folklorist Charles Perrault. It is more usually associated with the Brothers Grimm, who compiled their own version in the 19th century of what is ultimately a medieval fairy tale. Finally, in 1961, it was back to a canine tale when 101 Dalmatians was released, based on a novel by Dodie Smith. The tale is known to all. The evil Cruella de Vil devises a plan to make the coats of Dalmatians into fur coats, and 2 Dalmatians, Pongo and Perdita, have to intervene, eventually saving 101 Dalmatians from de Vil's evil plan. In 1964, a film was released by Disney Studios which Walt had acted as producer of and which was different from many of the studio's more landmark productions up to that time. This was not an animated film, yet was still aimed at young audiences. Mary Poppins was a musical comedy directed by Robert Stevenson, who had become well known in the 1930s for making King Solomon's Mines. It starred Julie Andrews as Mary Poppins, an idyllic nanny who comes to look after the children of George Banks, played by David Tomlinson. Dick Van Dyke featured as Poppins' close friend Bert. The story revolves around Mary's arrival at the Banks household and how she transforms their lives through her actions and her light-hearted nature. It features an iconic ending in which Poppins decides that her work with the Banks family is done and flies away using her umbrella. Mary Poppins would go on to earn $44 million in its theatrical release, making it the highest-grossing film of 1964, while it earned over $100 million worldwide, an enormous sum by the standards of the mid-1960s. It was nominated for 13 Academy Awards and won 5, including Julie Andrews for Best Actress and Best Picture for that year. It is widely considered to be the most successful live-action film ever produced by Walt Disney. In the early 1960s, Disney began working on a project that was different from others he had worked on before. Many people, especially if they have visited Disneyland, Florida, will be familiar with the term Epcot, but many do not realize that before it became one of the main theme parks at Disneyland, it was conceived as something very different. Epcot stands for the Experimental Prototype Community of Tomorrow. Through this, Disney imagined that he would erect a planned, utopian community on a large plot of land which he had obtained in Orlando, Florida. Other sites at places like Niagara Falls and St. Louis were considered early on, but the sunshine of Florida probably drew Disney to the site in the end. By 1965, Disney had acquired over 27,000 acres of land here, an estate roughly twice the size of Manhattan. He planned to build his utopian city here, one which would be surrounded by a giant dome and that would have a public transport system based on a monorail and a city center. Major elements of this plan would include a giant cosmopolitan hotel and a convention center. Green belts would then lead out into residential areas, with Disney incorporating the post-war fascination with the suburbs into his planned community. Everyone would be employed at Epcot, and everyone would have their homes updated with the latest technologies when they became available. The catch was that this would not be a democracy of any kind. Disney would effectively be the ruler of the utopian community, a responsibility he would exercise solely to make sure that everything worked as it should. This was government operating as a business enterprise. The idea of Epcot, as envisaged by Disney in the 1960s, would never be realized. However, many people will have heard the name today for the simple reason that Epcot became one of the main theme parks at Disneyland, Florida, a new major Disneyland built on the Orlando site in the 1960s and opened in 1971 as the Walt Disney World Resort. Originally, there was just one theme park here, the Magic Kingdom, which formed the basis for the original resort in 1971. Walt had planned this, and in his ideas for Epcot, it had been envisaged that the residents of Epcot would largely be employed as staff at the Magic Kingdom. The Epcot Center was opened as a second theme park in 1982, one which incorporated some design elements of Disney's plan for his utopian community, but which was instead a theme park designed to highlight cultures from around the world in giant spaces that immersed visitors in those cultures. Disney MGM Studios and the Animal Kingdom would open in 1989 and 1998 as the third and fourth theme parks. Walt Disney World is the most visited holiday resort in the world and, with over 77,000 employees, is the largest employer on a single site anywhere in the United States. Much of it was realized after Disney's own time, but it was very much his vision. Walt would never live to see the Magic Kingdom open, let alone Epcot and the other parks. Despite the wholesome image of the Disney brand, Walt Disney the man led a broadly unhealthy life, something he commented ironically on himself. In particular, he was a chronic chain smoker, something which was made worse by his preference for unfiltered cigarettes. The habit caught up with him when he was in his mid-60s. His breathing had been going downhill for years, and he eventually sought medical advice in 1966. He was soon diagnosed with lung cancer. Although the use of radioactive cobalt therapy had been introduced in the 1950s, lung cancer was still far less treatable in the 1960s than it is today. In any event, Disney's case was terminal by the time he was diagnosed. Within a few weeks, he was so poorly that he was sent to the hospital, from which he would never return. He died there on the 15th of December, 1966, just over a week after turning 65. Another Disney classic that he had been working on in his final years, The Jungle Book, an adaptation of Rudyard Kipling's novel, was released a few months later in 1967. In all, Disney had produced over 80 feature films, plus hundreds of short animated movies by the time he died. Walt was cremated after his funeral, and his remains were scattered in California. Roy Disney took over the company until his own death in 1971. One marked feature of Disney's career was that he was nominated for more Academy Awards than any other individual before or since, and won more as well. He, or the films he was responsible for producing, received 59 nominations, beginning with a nomination for Mickey's Orphans, a 1931 short film featuring Mickey Mouse, Minnie Mouse, and Pluto. It did not win at the 1932 Academy Awards, but on the very same evening, another Disney production, one of the Silly Symphony films, Flowers and Trees, became the first animated film to be honored with an Academy Award. It was also Disney's first Oscar. Thereafter, down to 1965, there were just 2 years, 1940 and 1963, that Disney was not nominated for an Academy Award. He won 22 Oscars in competitive categories and was awarded 4 honorary Oscars, one for the creation of Mickey Mouse in 1932, one for Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs in 1939, one in 1942 as a shared award for the technical sound innovations used in producing Fantasia, and a second honorary award in 1942 for the consistent quality of Disney's output. The 1932 award should probably have been shared with Iwerks. The 1939 Oscar has the distinction of having been a specially designed statuette featuring 7 miniature statuettes to symbolize the Seven Dwarfs. Disney continued to go from strength to strength after Walt's time. The company's presence on television expanded in the 1970s, and in 1980, the first home video titles were released by the company. The Disney Channel began broadcasting in 1983, just days after a new Disneyland opened in Tokyo, Japan. This international globetrotting would eventually result in a Disneyland in Paris and even a Disney Film Festival in the Soviet Union in 1988, prior to the end of the Cold War. Throughout all of this, successful movies and film franchises continued to appear under the Disney remit, notably the film Splash with Tom Hanks in the lead role in 1984, the Mighty Ducks films in the 1990s, and The Lion King in 1994. However, perhaps the greatest breakthrough was the release of the first Toy Story movie in 1995, not only because it was incredibly successful and spawned a franchise, the 5th installment of which is due to appear in 2026, but because Toy Story was also the first animated film produced entirely with computers. A perhaps bittersweet development for those at Disney who remembered the old-fashioned art of drawing every scene to make an animated film. The story has continued ever since, with major episodes in more recent years being Disney's acquisition of Marvel Entertainment and Lucasfilm in 2009 and 2012, the latter of which has made Disney the owner of the Star Wars franchise. Today, just after celebrating the 100-year anniversary of its founding, the company is one of the big 3 entertainment companies along with Comcast and Sony, 3 companies that are the largest entertainment companies in the world by some margin. Walt Disney was one of the foremost figures in the history of modern popular entertainment. Starting out as an illustrator and cartoonist in the Midwest when he was just a teenager in the late 1910s, Walt quickly developed ambitions to produce more than just drawings for advertisers and short animated movies for other companies. He moved westward in 1923 to California, where Hollywood had already emerged as the center of the American film industry before the talkies were even first developed. There he set up what would become the most successful animated film studio in Hollywood history, one which produced some of the most iconic children's characters of the modern age, Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck, and Goofy the dog, while also reimagining a whole slew of fairy tales collected in the 19th century by the Brothers Grimm and other folklorists, as well as more modern books, into films like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Fantasia, and Cinderella. In all of this, the contributions of Iwerks and others should not be overlooked. There is also no doubt that Disney could be a controversial figure. His decision to allow Leni Riefenstahl to visit his studios in 1938 certainly displayed poor judgment, and he was an often unpleasant character himself in his personal relationships. It should also be noted that Disney's output under him represented something of a dumbing down of American culture. Bambi, for instance, was completely shorn of the political message of Felix Salten's book, while Disney's production of The Jungle Book has created the impression that it was Kipling's defining work, whereas in reality, the 1901 novel Kim is Kipling's masterpiece. These issues aside, Disney was a visionary, as his plans for Disneyland and Epcot later in his life demonstrate. Visionaries are not always easy individuals to know on a personal level, but they can often end up leaving an indelible mark on the world, something which Walt Disney surely did. What do you think of Walt Disney? Was he simply what he appeared to be, an entertainer who produced some of the most iconic children's stories of the modern age, or do some of the revelations about his politics and character detract from his legacy? Has the Disney image been tarnished in other ways by corporate greed? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. The man known to history as King George I was born on the 28th of May, 1660 in the city of Hanover in north-central Germany, in what was then the Duchy of Brunswick-Lüneburg. His father was Ernest Augustus, the Duke of Brunswick-Lüneburg. He would acquire further titles in subsequent years, notably that of Prince Bishop of Osnabrück and, most importantly, the Prince Elector of Hanover, which he was awarded in 1692, a title of considerable importance within the Holy Roman Empire. George's mother was Sophia of the Palatinate, a large principality that controlled much of western Germany along the course of the River Rhine. She had familial ties to many of Europe's most prominent ruling families, notably in England, Scotland, and Ireland. Her marriage to Ernest Augustus in 1658 was a political one and brought further ties to lineages such as the Danish royal family, to which Ernest Augustus was related. George was their first child. 6 more would follow, 5 more boys and 1 daughter named Sophia Charlotte, who would become Queen of Prussia through marriage one day. Of the boys, the younger sons would take up military careers, given that they were never realistically in line to succeed to the Hanoverian titles, though George would have a rivalry of sorts with the next oldest son, Frederick Augustus. Frederick was born in 1661, and there was a good possibility throughout much of his life that he would succeed to some of the Hanoverian lands, as the principle of primogeniture, whereby the firstborn son, or daughter where no sons were available, would succeed to the entirety of the family estate, was not legally established yet in Hanover by the second half of the 17th century, a legacy of the medieval era when dominions were often divided between several sons. The succession politics of Hanover were not the only complication at the time of George's birth. Germany in those days was a confusing patchwork of political entities. Back in the High Middle Ages and late medieval period, Germany had been divided into literally hundreds of different political entities, some being large duchies, margraviates, principalities, and counties, while others were small free cities and territories. Many bishops and other ecclesiastical lords also ruled small states themselves. All of these were loosely confederated under the umbrella of the Holy Roman Empire, with an emperor elected by 7 electors from amongst the most powerful German states, though the imperial office by the 17th century was virtually a hereditary title for the Austrian House of Habsburg. A process of centralization had been underway in the 16th and 17th centuries, with many of the smaller states being absorbed by their larger neighbors. Even so, there were still well over 100 German states by the time George was born. The Duchy of Brunswick-Lüneburg was one of the larger ones. Thus, George was born into a family of substantial political power in 17th-century Germany. To make matters even more confusing, some of these states were Lutheran Protestant, some were Roman Catholic, and others still adhered to the Reformed or Calvinist branch of Protestantism. These religious divisions had led to a century and a half of political tension in Central Europe following the Protestant Reformation. When George was born in 1660, the Holy Roman Empire was still recovering from the 30 Years' War, which, between 1618 and 1648, had led to devastation across Germany as the Austrian Habsburgs tried unsuccessfully to enforce Catholicism across Central Europe. George's childhood was a relatively happy one by all accounts. His mother doted on him and his siblings to a degree uncommon amongst the upper aristocracy at that time. He was evidently not his parents' favorite, but he was viewed as a good eldest child, one who was conscientious, sober, and responsible from a young age, necessary qualities in a political heir. He received an education from the governor and receptor of the household until his 15th year in 1675, learning to speak and write in German, French, and Latin. His main interests early on, however, lay in hunting and riding, and he and his father bonded over these activities. That same year of 1675, when his formal education ended, he also began his career as a military officer, campaigning with his father against the French and allied with the Dutch in the Franco-Dutch War. George was present at the Battle of Konzer-Bruck late that summer and took part in several more campaigns in 1676 and 1677. In 1679, he was afforded the title of Duke of Hanover, a sign of his position as senior heir to his father. With this title, he was sent to England in 1680 to visit the court of King Charles II there and to spend some time at Oxford, where he was given an honorary degree. It remains a matter of debate as to whether or not marriage negotiations were tentatively entered into for George to marry King Charles's niece, Anne. In any event, they resulted in nothing if they were. Back in Germany after his English trip, an arrangement was worked out whereby George would marry his first cousin, his uncle George William's daughter, Sophia Dorothea. This union was arrived at as a means of preventing the splitting up of the family lands and to solidify George's future financial position by uniting Hanover with the Celle lands that his uncle controlled. It was hardly an ideal basis for marriage and would end in tragedy for her years later. In the short term, it resulted in children after they married in November 1682, George being 22 years of age and his bride just 16. A boy, named George Ludwig, was born almost exactly a year after the marriage. Their second and last child, a girl named Sophia Dorothea after her mother, was born 4 years later in 1687. Many years later, she would marry Prince Frederick William I of Prussia, a marriage from which came a child named Frederick, who became Frederick II. Thus, George was the grandfather of the Prussian ruler who became known as Frederick the Great, the man who was responsible for Prussia's emergence as a great European power in the 18th century. Not long after he married Sophia Dorothea, George was involved in one of the most seismic events in early modern European history, though one that is largely forgotten about today. For 300 years, since the late 14th century, the Ottoman Turks had been expanding their control over the Balkans, while their empire eventually grew to include the Levant and most of North Africa as well, meaning that Ottoman fleets controlled much of the Mediterranean Sea. Since the 1520s, they had controlled most of Hungary and other parts of the Carpathian Basin. Now in 1683, the Grand Vizier of the Ottoman government, Kara Mustafa Pasha, attempted to capture the city of Vienna from the Austrian Habsburgs and laid siege to the Austrian capital with an army of 150,000 men. The city was comparatively underdefended and would surely have fallen to the Turks had a grand alliance of Christian states of Central Europe not been formed by John III Sobieski, King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania. Hanover contributed to the relief effort and George headed along to campaign to Vienna, fighting in the Great Battle of Vienna on the 12th of September, 1683, a clash which resulted in Christian victory and stopped an Ottoman expansion into Central Europe. The brothers continued to campaign against the Turks periodically in the years that followed, as an alliance of Christian states in Central Europe became determined to push the Ottoman Empire back and ensure it never posed a threat to Vienna again. Eventually, in 1791, George's brother Frederick would be killed while campaigning. By then, though, the possibility that George and he would split the Hanoverian dominions between them was gone. Much to Frederick's frustration, in the mid-1680s, their father had decreed that henceforth Hanover would follow the principle of primogeniture and that all of his lands would consequently pass to George upon his death, provided his eldest son was still alive at that time. It was a very belated decision in Europe, where virtually every other major power had adopted primogeniture centuries earlier. Not long after Frederick's death, the political importance of the state George would one day inherit increased sizably. Since the mid-14th century, there had typically been 7 prince-electors within the Holy Roman Empire that elected the Holy Roman Emperor whenever that office fell vacant. These were the King of Bohemia, the Duke of Saxony, the Margrave of Brandenburg, the Count Palatine of the Rhine, and the Prince-Archbishops of Mainz, Cologne, and Trier. During the 30 Years' War, the Count Palatine of the Rhine had been replaced briefly by the Duke of Bavaria as a reward for Duke Maximilian I's loyalty to the Austrian Habsburgs. When the war ended, the Count Palatine was readmitted, increasing the number of electors to 8. This created a voting problem, as an even number of electors could become deadlocked with equal votes for 2 different candidates. There were growing calls thereafter for a 9th elector to be added, ones which became even more vocal from 1685 onwards after Philip William of Neuburg became Count Palatine of the Rhine. Philip William was a Catholic and his accession threw the religious balance of the Electoral College out of order. Thus, in 1692, George's father was admitted as the 9th Prince-Elector, officially known as the Elector of Hanover. George would inherit this title one day and was now clearly one of the foremost political heirs of Central Europe. By the time George's father was elevated to the position of Elector of Hanover, a controversy was brewing at the Hanoverian court. George and his wife's marriage had never been close, but it had become even more strained in the second half of the 1680s as he spent more and more time absent from Hanover campaigning against the Turks and on other duties. By the early 1690s, their indifference towards each other had turned into contempt, and George took a mistress by the name of Irengard Melusine von der Schulenburg in 1691. They would eventually have 3 illegitimate daughters together, the first born in January 1692. Sophia responded in kind, and in 1692 she began an affair with Philip Christoph von Königsmark, a Swedish noble and military officer in the Hanoverian army. They were not discreet in this, and by 1694 the affair had begun to cause such a controversy at the Hanoverian court that a group of courtiers murdered von Königsmark that summer. George was not involved in the act, although he possibly knew that it was being planned. Several months later, George and Sophia's marriage was dissolved as Sophia refused to cohabit with George following the murder of her lover. She was sent thereafter to what amounted to house imprisonment at Alden House in Lüneburg and would spend the next 3 decades there, down to her death in 1726, a harsh fate. Yet she did little to improve her situation by becoming a focus of conspiracies within the Hanoverian dominions for years to come. George would continue his relationship with Melusine for the remainder of his life, but they never married, and he also had other mistresses at various junctures. While George was in his late 20s, developments which might have seemed unrelated to him were occurring several hundred kilometers to the west of Hanover in England, events that would have profound bearing on his later life and those of his descendants. In 1685, King Charles II of England, Scotland, and Ireland had died without a legitimate heir, despite siring over a dozen illegitimate children. He was succeeded by his brother, James, Duke of York. The accession of King James II was very problematic, as he was a Roman Catholic in a country which had become staunchly Protestant over the previous century and a half. It wasn't long before his heavy-handed manner of governing and his religion led to a coup, and in 1688 the Glorious Revolution occurred. Through this, James was deposed in favor of his Protestant daughter, Mary, and her Dutch husband, William of Orange. Mary II and William III did not have any children, and so following Mary's death in 1694 and William's in 1702, the throne passed to Mary's sister, Queen Anne, and accession did not hold out the prospect of a simple line of succession either. Though having numerous children and being pregnant 14 times at least, and had a brutal natal history, and virtually all of her children had been lost during pregnancy or died before reaching their 2nd birthday. In the summer of 1700, her only remaining child, 11-year-old Prince William, died. There was now no clear successor to, and in the eyes of England's Protestants, who refused to countenance the possibility of old King James's Catholic son, who lived in exile in France, succeeding and one day. All of this had implications for George, as the House of Hanover was related to the English royal House of Stuart. George was the great-grandson of King James I, who had ruled England between 1603 and 1625. James had a daughter named Elizabeth who, in 1613, had married Frederick V, the Elector Palatine who ruled over a large German principality along the River Rhine. One of their children, born in the autumn of 1630, was none other than George's mother, Sophia. As such, George had a claim to the English throne, one which was further solidified in 1701 when the English Parliament passed an Act of Settlement that legally prohibited any Roman Catholic from succeeding to the throne of England, a measure designed to block the Catholic branch of the House of Stuart from resuming the throne once and died. With this, it became clear that George might be the most likely successor to Anne. There was precedent for a foreigner succeeding to the English throne in this way. After all, George's great-grandfather, King James I, was a Scotsman who had succeeded to the English throne back in 1603 by right of being the great-great-grandson of King Henry VII of England, the founder of the Tudor dynasty back in 1485. George's father died in late January 1698. With that, George ascended as Prince Elector of Hanover at 37 years of age, and with the associated titles of Duke of Brunswick-Lüneburg and Prince Bishop of Osnabrück. Over the next decade and a half, much of his focus would be on the War of the Spanish Succession, through which a grand alliance of Britain, Austria, the Dutch Republic, and smaller German states such as Hanover sought to prevent a member of the French royal family from succeeding to the Spanish throne following the extinction of the direct Habsburg royal line there in 1700 when King Charles II died. Hanover was one of the more minor players in the war, which was waged from 1701 down to 1714, though still an important partner of the British, fighting against some of the pro-French German states such as Bavaria and Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel. Throughout it, George was an active war leader, campaigning himself in person during most campaigns. His qualities as a general were considerable, and in 1707 he was offered the position of imperial field marshal within the Holy Roman Empire. In the end, Hanover was one of the few states that emerged well out of the war after sheer exhaustion led to peace treaties being signed in 1713 and 1714, with its position as the ninth elector of the Holy Roman Empire acknowledged by all parties and some lands gained at the expense of its smaller neighbors like Wolfenbüttel. Another of the main issues which would come to concern George in his time as Elector of Hanover was the Great Northern War. In the 16th century, numerous powers had emerged in northern and eastern Europe that became rivals for dominance of the Baltic Sea and the Baltic states region around modern-day Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia. The three main players were the Kingdom of Sweden, Tsarist Russia, and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, with the dual monarchy of Denmark-Norway also playing a part and some of the smaller North German states being dragged into the conflicts occasionally. Wars had periodically occurred. They were all eclipsed, though, by the clash which broke out in 1700. The Great Northern War was launched by Peter the Great of Russia in an effort to end Sweden's dominance of the Baltic Sea and to acquire a Baltic Sea port for Russia, the region around modern-day St. Petersburg being controlled by Sweden at that time. Russia found allies in Warsaw and Copenhagen amongst the Poles, Lithuanians, and Danes, while numerous other powers would be pulled in from time to time from around Europe in a clash that would last 21 years. George was always sympathetic towards the Russian cause. In appraising this position, one needs to consider that Sweden in the 17th century had taken control of much of the Baltic coastline of northern Germany around Mecklenburg eastwards into Pomerania. With Hanover's lands lying just to the south, anything which weakened the Swedes could potentially be in Hanover's interests. Consequently, George informally allied himself with Russia, the Poles, and the Danes, though he did not enter the war for many years. Indeed, Russian victory at the Battle of Poltava in 1709 seemed to have brought the war to an end in Swedish defeat, but in 1715 King Charles XII of Sweden returned home after years in exile and reignited the conflict. At this juncture, George decided to enter the war fully on the side of Russia and Peter the Great's other allies, hoping to gain land in the eventual peace negotiations. In the years that followed, George contributed tens of thousands of troops towards the war in northern Europe as Charles XII tried to re-establish Swedish dominance over the Baltic and to conquer Norway from the Danes. His death at the siege of Frederikston in November 1718 ended matters for the most part, and the new Swedish government quickly sought to bring the Great Northern War to an end. George benefited immensely from the difficult position the Swedes were in, and through the Treaty of Stockholm, signed in November 1719, his negotiators secured the duchies of Bremen and Verden in northern Germany as the spoils of war. For all of the time that Hanoverian troops were fighting the Swedes, George was directing their activities from England rather than Germany. On the 1st of August, 1714, George's cousin Queen Anne died. Her death came 8 weeks after that of George's own mother Sophia at 83 years of age. Hence, the way was cleared for George to succeed and as King of Britain and Ireland. Extensive measures had been put in place before Anne ever died to prepare for the succession of the House of Hanover and to avoid the Catholic son of the deposed King James II in France from trying to pursue his claim to the throne. Thus, in an age before telecommunications of any kind, George had already been proclaimed as the King of Britain and Ireland in London long before he even knew that Anne was dead. It would be days before he learned of the events, and then it took several weeks for the preparations to be made for him to travel to England and to enter London as the new monarch. Subtle signs of his accession were seen in the royal documentation associated with the succession, the new king signing documents with the anglicized version of his name George with an E rather than the German George without an E within days of ascending to the throne. George landed at Greenwich near London on the 18th of September, 1714 with a large party of German nobles and courtiers, including his mistress and his children. 2 days later, the royal party entered London around midday, the procession proceeding slowly through the capital over a course of several hours so that the over 500,000 inhabitants of the city had a chance to see their new monarch in an age when the physical presence of the king and his image on coins were the only real mechanisms for projecting royal power into the public domain. All told, it was a fairly seamless succession given the variables involved and the threat of the plans being destabilized in a country where many people were distinctly unhappy with the idea of a German dynasty ascending as the royal family, no matter their relation to the House of Stuart. Matters were not helped by the fact that George arrived in England unable to speak the language of his subjects, although he could converse in French with many people in government and with the nobility, as this was the lingua franca of European court society in the 17th and 18th centuries. Nevertheless, it was not a good look for a man who was either fully or partially proficient in German, French, Latin, Dutch, and Italian, to have not bothered to begin learning English years earlier in expectation of becoming King of Britain. While the Hanoverian succession had been affected with few problems in London when George and his court arrived there in September, the signs of discontent were more tangible elsewhere. Riots and public disorder offences rose in the weeks that followed George's arrival in England in cities and towns across the country, peaking on the 20th of October, the day of the new king's coronation at Westminster, a service which was normally carried out in English, but which was celebrated in Latin so that George and his courtiers from Germany could understand what was being said. As undesirable as the riots were, they paled in significance to what occurred north of the border in Scotland. Tensions were still running high in Scotland in 1714 as a result of the 1707 Act of Union, which had joined the monarchies of England and Scotland into the new entity of Great Britain and had brought the Scottish Parliament to an end as well. In the months following the accession, many nobles there, led by the Earl of Mar, began plotting to restore the House of Stuart by declaring their support for James II's son, James Edward Stuart. In August 1715, they launched a short-lived rebellion in the Scottish Highlands. It proved relatively easy to suppress it by the end of the year, though corresponding revolts had been planned in Scotland and in parts of England around Bristol and along the southern ports. Had the Jacobite uprising been better planned, and had the Dutch not sent thousands of troops to Britain on short notice to honor the terms of a treaty signed with the English government in Anne's time, through which they had promised to aid in ensuring that George ascended to the throne smoothly, things could have played out very differently. As it was, George's regime survived this initial scare quite easily. The political system in the country George had arrived to rule was substantially different from what he was used to in Hanover. Hanover was still an autocratic principality where the Elector Prince ruled in association with ministers and bureaucrats that he selected personally. Britain, by way of contrast, was already well along the way to becoming a fully fledged modern constitutional monarchy. The civil wars of the 1640s and the Glorious Revolution of 1688 had reduced the power of the monarchy and strengthened Parliament, the latter of which was a nearly permanently sitting body that governed the nation and its affairs. The senior officers of state, however, were still picked by the monarch, rather than being elected, though they had to command some parliamentary support to remain in office. While nearly all of these constitutional changes had occurred during the Stuart era, George had his own place in British political history in being the monarch under whom the concept of a modern prime minister emerged. In the late 1710s, he came under increasing pressure from the parliamentary House of Commons to appoint Robert Walpole, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, as the head of the administration. George was not initially favorable to the idea. Nevertheless, following a financial crisis in 1720, he eventually capitulated and Walpole became the de facto Prime Minister of Britain in 1721. He would hold that office for the next 21 years until 1742, becoming the longest-serving Prime Minister in British history, as well as the first. While Walpole did dominate the government from 1721 onwards, George was not averse to playing some role in British political affairs. He had demonstrated this in 1717 when he pushed for the agreement known as the Triple Alliance. This was agreed between Britain, the Dutch Republic, and France and was a major reorientation of European politics. For decades since the Franco-Dutch War broke out in 1672, England and the Dutch had generally been in conflict with France. The death of King Louis XIV in 1715 opened the way for realignment in such a way that would prevent the near-constant state of war that had existed between 1672 and 1714, with the Franco-Dutch War, the 9 Years' War, and the War of the Spanish Succession having mired Western and Central Europe in conflict for 28 of those 42 years. The alliance was also formed as a means of signaling to Spain, which felt betrayed by the losses it had sustained at the end of the War of the Spanish Succession, not to seek a new war with the hope of French aid. The Triple Alliance of 1717 was more of a non-aggression pact than a full military alliance, but it was effective all the same. In contrast to his time as Elector of Hanover, George's reign as King of Great Britain was markedly peaceful, with no major wars enveloping Europe again until the War of the Austrian Succession broke out in 1740. There were other issues that arose during the reign between George and some political groupings in England. One concerned religion and his attitude towards the Church of England. George was a Lutheran, a moderate Protestant. On the surface, this posed little problem, but England had a complicated religious landscape in which Protestants were not simply opposed to Catholics. There were both moderate and radical forms of Protestantism, with Anglicans who conformed to the Church of England being the more moderate wing, while others were favorers of Calvinism or Puritanism, as it is termed in England. Both sides feared that George would prove either too moderate or too radical. In the end, he outflanked both sides by steering a via media, favoring a politique approach to religion, the primary goal of which was avoiding religious controversy of all kinds. Catholicism was the enemy in George's eyes, and so he sought to dampen religious tensions amongst Protestants. Elsewhere, when it came to Parliament, George was forced to make concessions in the form of the Peerage Bill of 1719, a piece of legislation which was introduced to halt the creation of new peers or nobles out of a general concern that too many Germans were being awarded British noble titles following the Hanoverian succession. The Peerage Bill was as much directed against the Prince of Wales as it was against the king himself. George's son, the future King George II, was a forceful figure who tried to play a role in British political life in the first years of his father's reign in Britain. This soon led to conflict between father and son in a relationship that had always been strained. Matters came to a head in 1717 over the arrangements for the baptizing of the Prince of Wales's son, George's grandson, Prince George William. The ceremony descended into an argument between the Prince of Wales and the Duke of Newcastle, leading to a challenge of a duel. Annoyed by this public display of impetuosity by his son, a rift ensued between king and prince, one that dragged on well into 1718. They were eventually reconciled to some extent, but the relationship between George and his heir was always a strained one. It is difficult to get a sense of who the man managing this transition in British government was. Historians have tended to view George as one of the most elusive and secretive of all the country's monarchs. There were contradictions. For instance, his correspondence with his daughter Sophia Dorothea indicates a loving parent. On the other hand, his treatment of his wife, Sophia's mother, was abysmal. The same contradictions existed when it came to his role as monarch. His failure to learn to speak English in advance of Anne's death, along with the sporadic manner in which he picked up some of the language thereafter, seems to indicate a lack of interest in what his British subjects thought of him. At the same time, however, there is evidence that when he did begin to learn more English in the 1720s, it was for the purposes of discerning how he was being written about in the English newspapers. He was socially awkward and never became comfortable in his position as head of a large royal court, yet in more relaxed environments behind closed doors with friends, he could be strikingly informal for a monarch, favoring bawdy jokes and being quite self-deprecating. One thing is for sure, he was not, as some earlier generations of historians made out, an unintelligent man. No ruler that was dim could have managed the Hanoverian succession as successfully as he did. Although he was not naturally inclined to be a sociable figure, George attempted to make himself a more publicly visible ruler in England than he had been in Hanover, the better to foster a closer relationship with his new subjects and offset the chances of any further revolts such as those which had already marked the first year of his reign. A notable element of this was his public feasts that he held at one of the more prominent royal residences of the 18th century, Hampton Court. During the summers, he would invite dozens of guests to these feasts held on the grounds of this location, while more still would be invited to attend the gardens there, where George would progress in the evenings, meeting his subjects and hearing their petitions. Through these interactions and his own efforts, he slowly began to learn English. How fluent he became has been debated, but there are government documents from the 1720s, years after he arrived in England, which demonstrate that he was able to read English to a certain extent by that time. He also presided over regular hunting trips to which members of England's nobility and political and economic communities were invited. Spending on his court was high and was geared towards winning over the political classes in England, cementing the status of the Hanoverian dynasty as the new royal family. It must be said that George's court did not offer patronage to many great thinkers. This, though, was something of an accidental happenstance of the times. It simply so happened that numerous prominent academics and artistic figures within British society had either died or were at the twilight of their lives when George came to the throne. John Locke, the great philosopher and essayist, had died in 1704. Christopher Wren, the brilliant architect who oversaw the reconstruction of London following the Great Fire of 1666, was still alive, though his foremost accomplishments were behind him when George came to England, and Wren died in 1723. Isaac Newton, the father of modern physics and one of the most accomplished scientists in human history, was kept on as Master of the Royal Mint by George, though he was already in his 70s at the time of the Hanoverian succession, and his most pioneering work lay behind him. Others, such as the poet Alexander Pope, who were in the full prime of their career, were satirists of the royal court. While there was no Wren, Locke, or Newton in their full brilliance for George to patronize, he did support the London theatres in the cultural sphere, with the Haymarket Theatre opening its doors in the capital in 1720. The king frequented the London theatres when productions of French plays by the likes of Molière, Corneille, and Racine were being staged, his limited grasp of English reducing the degree to which he favoured English playwrights. If there was one brilliant cultural figure associated with George's court in England, it was surely the composer George Frederick Handel. Born in Halle in Germany in 1685, Handel had learned his craft in Germany and Italy before relocating to London in 1712 on an invitation from Charles Montague, the first Duke of Manchester. He was still there when George succeeded to the throne in 1714, a fortuitous succession, as Handel had briefly served as Kapellmeister or Master of the Choir in Hanover in 1710 in George's employ as Elector of Hanover. Over the next 30 years, he would compose an enormous array of operas and librettos in England, emerging as arguably the greatest England-based composer of the Baroque and classical eras of Western music and the only figure associated with the Hanoverian court that could compare with composers like Johann Sebastian Bach and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart on the continent in the 18th century. George patronized some of Handel's work, and many of his operas premiered at the King's Theatre in London during the 1720s. Surely one of George's most significant, though underrated, accomplishments was the manner in which he furthered the expansion of Britain's burgeoning empire. When he came to the throne, England had already settled colonies in many regions. By then, the initial English colonies that had been founded in Virginia and New England in the early 17th century had been expanded through the granting of new charters to would-be colonists and war with the Dutch to secure New Netherland, which was seized and renamed New York, resulting in an unbroken string of colonies stretching from New Hampshire in the north-south to the Carolinas. In the Caribbean, there were numerous prosperous sugar plantation colonies on islands like Jamaica, Barbados, and smaller enclaves like Street Kitts and Nevis. Elsewhere, while England only had a few coastal toeholds in India, its commercial activities here were expanding under the aegis of the English East India Company. This was a significant base to commence from. George's reign saw a modest but important expansion of this colonial activity. One notable element of this, which still impacts the geography and administration of the United States 3 centuries later, was the establishment of a new colony in the region lying south of the Carolinas and north of the Spanish presence in Florida. Colonists had begun settling here to avoid the jurisdiction of either the Carolina or Virginia colonial governments in the late 17th century, but the expansion into the area accelerated in the 1710s and 1720s. George's government encouraged and began preparing to establish a new proprietorial colony there, though it would be a few years after his death that this was finalized. It was named Georgia and would go on to become the modern-day U.S. state that bears the same name. Elsewhere, a British colony on the island of Newfoundland in what is now eastern Canada, that had been established during the latter stages of Queen Anne's reign, was expanded by George's government, while, in the Caribbean, the Bahamas became a British Crown colony in the 1720s after George's government had engaged in an extensive campaign to suppress the pirates operating here in the second half of the 1710s. In other respects, George's reign set more nefarious precedents. The 1710s and 1720s saw a considerable increase in Britain's involvement in the transatlantic slave trade, and the king himself benefited hugely from this trade. George's profits from the slave trade accrued primarily from his position as governor of the South Sea Company, a joint stock company which had been established in 1711 with the goal of reducing the national debt after years of involvement in the War of the Spanish Succession. This was to be achieved by undertaking new trading voyages to the South Seas, the early modern term for the South Pacific, an area which, unlike the Atlantic Ocean and the Indian Ocean, was still relatively underexplored and underexploited by the European powers in the 18th century. With the war coming to an end as George I took the throne, and with a new monopoly on slave trading between Africa and certain South American ports within Spain's empire as a concession of the peace talks, speculative investment poured into the South Sea Company. There had been economic bubbles already in the history of nascent European capitalism, notably the tulip mania in the Dutch Republic back in the 1630s, but this was the first instance of this on such a scale in England. Although it was a newly formed company and had realized no profits of any kind, when shares in the South Sea Company were floated in London in the late 1710s, a frenzy to acquire them began. The resulting bubble was exacerbated by the board members who exaggerated the scale of the perceived profits to be made. As a consequence, between late 1719 and May 1720, the price of shares rocketed up from just over £100 to £600, eventually reaching nearly £1,000 per share for a few days that summer. Then it all burst, and in the course of 1721, shares fell back to below £100. The South Sea Company did not go bust and would function as a valuable joint stock company until the mid-19th century, exploiting things like the whaling industry in the South Atlantic. However, the South Sea Bubble of 1720 ruined the personal finances of many individuals. Incredibly, even before the bubble burst, George's government had already passed the Bubble Act in June 1720, which sought to prevent further economic bubbles of the kind that was still underway. Bizarrely, even as the government was legislating against it, speculators continued to invest in the bubble. Beyond these colonial ventures, George's reign saw a reaffirmation of what is often termed the blue water policy in Britain's imperial history. This was an unwritten rule of English foreign and military policy to promote the Royal Navy as the best means of extending Britain's empire abroad and protecting Britain against all enemies at home in Europe. A policy of this kind could be said to have been initiated as far back as the reign of Elizabeth I in the second half of the 16th century, but successive reigns saw it reaffirmed, notably through the professionalization of the Royal Navy in the 17th century. The Hanoverians, beginning with George I, gave fresh impetus to this, and over the course of the next century and a half, Britain would emerge as the preeminent global superpower, based almost entirely on the strength of its navy and dominance of the world seas. That process was already very much underway during George's reign. The manner in which British naval power was employed in the 1720s to curb efforts by Spain to retake Gibraltar and Minorca, which it had lost during the War of the Spanish Succession, underscored the manner in which effective British sea power would be the cornerstone of a successful foreign policy going forward in the 18th century. One part of Britain's empire, the one that was closest to home, was a perpetual problem, and in George's reign, this was no different. This was Ireland. The country had been partially conquered in the 12th and 13th centuries, then fully conquered in the 16th, but there had been major revolts there in the 1590s, the 1640s, and the late 1680s, all with the goal of re-establishing the paramount position of the Roman Catholic majority. All of these rebellions had been defeated and had led to a growing Protestant ascendancy in which English, Welsh, and Scottish nobles and landlords controlled over 80% of the land, despite only constituting about 15% of the population. Even this Protestant elite were problematic in the eyes of administrators in London, and in the 1710s, a scandal had arisen whereby the Irish House of Lords had intervened in the management of the Irish courts. This was viewed as a step too far towards legislative and judicial independence in England, and in 1719, George's government oversaw the passage of the Declaratory Act. Given the royal assent by the king in 1720, it effectively subordinated the Irish Parliament to the English Parliament and was an important step in the eventual disestablishment of the Irish Parliament in 1800 through the Act of Union, whereby the Irish Parliament was dispensed with altogether, and henceforth Irish politicians had to take their seats in the English Parliament at Westminster. Measures like these, which were given George's imprimatur, did not go unopposed in Ireland. One of the most vocal critics of the policies of the early Hanoverian government was Jonathan Swift. Swift was an Anglo-Irish satirist and writer who also served as the Dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin. His reputation was already established by the time George ascended to the throne in England in 1714, but it was during George's reign that he wrote many of his most famous works, most of which were veiled critiques of crown policy in Ireland. Gulliver's Travels, published in 1726, is the most well-known, but the text which most directly attacked the king and his government was the Drapier's Letters. These were a series of 7 pamphlets published in 1724 and 1725 in response to the granting of a license to produce copper coins in Ireland to William Wood, an ironmonger and manufacturer. The license was highly unorthodox and was only granted to Wood in 1722 because he had paid a huge £10,000 bribe to George's long-term mistress and the mother of his younger children, Melusine von der Schulenburg. In attacking Wood and the manner in which he had received his license to mint coins by bribing the royal mistress, Swift was taking a major risk, and the texts were published pseudonymously under the name M. B. Drapier, though it was widely known that Swift was the author. Swift only became more audacious in his satire, and towards the end of George's reign, he began working on what would eventually be published in 1729 as a modest proposal for preventing the children of poor people from being a burthen to their parents or country, a scathing attack on English attitudes towards poor Irish Catholics in which he satirically proposed that children should be sold as food to the rich in order to disburden the Hanoverian state of the cost of providing them with charity. To add to the many overseas realms that George had to manage, he still had the government of Hanover to oversee. Unlike Britain, Ireland, and the British colonies in North America and the Caribbean, the German lands remained directly under George's control and were not subject to oversight by the British Parliament or George's ministers in England. Although he lived for most of his life after 1714 in England, George returned to Germany periodically, visiting in 1716, 1719, 1723, and again in 1725, the latter visit carrying on into early 1726. In total, he spent approximately 2.5 years in Hanover between 1714 and 1727. During one of these visits, he finalized the Treaty of Charlottenburg, through which an alliance was formalized between Britain, Prussia, and the electorate of Hanover, though many of the terms outlined in it, including marriage alliances that would involve George's children and grandchildren, were never followed through on. The episode is indicative of the international diplomacy which generally ensued when George visited Hanover, though the day-to-day governance of his German dominions was placed in the hands of administrators such as Andreas Gottlieb von Bemstorff and Hans Caspar von Bothmeier, whom George trusted implicitly to run affairs in his absence. More generally, George was at his happiest in these years when visiting home, and the role of being King of Britain and Ireland was evidently a burden on him rather than a sought-after desire. George's final years were ones of increasing retirement. He allowed Walpole to continue running the government and stepped back even further from day-to-day administration. The few acts which he did engage in were symptomatic of this. For instance, George is generally credited with creating the Order of the Bath, one of Britain's highest chivalric honor classes, in 1725, junior today only to the Order of the Garter and the Order of the Thistle, but the new honor was really Walpole's design as he developed a new honor which he could use to reward his own allies, and it became a form of patronage offered by him as Prime Minister rather than by the King as monarch. Elsewhere, the Treaty of Charlottenburg was followed by the Treaty of Hanover in 1725, through which Britain, Hanover, Prussia, and France allied with one another in response to the signing of the Treaty of Vienna months earlier, which had seen Austria and Spain draw closer to one another. The effects of this were considerable. For decades, Britain had been closely aligned with Austria, but George's reign saw this alliance end and a reorientation to draw closer to Prussia, the emerging German power. Beyond such concerns, George spent much of his later years engaging with his growing brood of grandchildren. An interesting side note is that in the second half of 1726, he offered a home in exile to a young Voltaire, the future giant of the French Enlightenment, having had to absent himself from France after getting into an argument with the powerful Duc de Rohan. It was in England that Voltaire came into contact with an environment of liberality that he later claimed shaped his work for decades to come after he returned to France. George was in his mid-60s by the summer of 1727 when he determined to visit Hanover again, having been in England for nearly a year and a half. He had made it across the Channel and was traveling through the Dutch Republic when he became ill in mid-June. As the royal entourage stopped that evening, he complained of stomach cramps and chest pains, something which he initially attributed to indigestion from having consumed too much fruit the previous evening. Insisting that they continue on their way, with medical staff attending to him in his carriage, George suffered a stroke early in the morning of the 9th of June. The party rushed to the city of Osnabrück, where George died 2 days later on the 11th of June at 67 years of age. His remains were taken on to Hanover, and he was interred in the Langschloss Palace in his homeland, though he was subsequently reburied at the Herrenhausen Gardens after the Second World War. George was the last reigning British monarch to be buried outside of England and just one of 6 since the Norman conquest to be so, the others being William the Conqueror, Henry II, and Richard I in the 11th and 12th centuries, James II in France as a result of his being deposed in 1688, and Philip II, who was buried in Spain, the realm he governed for decades in the 16th century after his wife, Mary Tudor, died in 1558. As such, George's burial in Germany was a very unusual development for an English monarch. George's reign in many ways laid the foundation for the massive expansion of the British Empire over the next century. During the reign of his son and successor, King George II, which lasted down to 1760, Britain's commercial and colonial interests grew, with the first array of large conquests in India in the mid-1750s, around the same time that Britain was displacing the French from Canada. Not long afterwards, James Cook would begin his expeditions to the South Seas, around which there had been so much speculative investment in George's time, exploring much of the Pacific Ocean and paving the way for British colonization of Australia, New Zealand, and Tasmania. By the time George's great-grandson, King George III, died in 1820, the sun rarely set on the British Empire, and Britain had emerged as the wealthiest nation in the world, the home of the Industrial Revolution and modern capitalism. That this was possible was owing to the political stability at home in England, which ensued from the Hanoverian succession. George I is a generally underappreciated British monarch. There are plenty of reasons why this is the case. Britain, for instance, did not fight in any major war during his reign, other than playing a small role in the Northern War, and he was a generally uncontroversial monarch. His reign was rather dull in a sense, by comparison with the civil wars and political battles which characterized England's history in the 17th century, or indeed the much more colorful reign of his great-grandson, George III, in whose time the American Revolutionary War was fought, the British Raj was formed, Britain led resistance to the French Empire of Napoleon Bonaparte, and the Industrial Revolution began. But in a way, what Britain needed in 1714 when George came to the throne was a dull monarch, one who would oversee the Hanoverian succession without arousing too much animosity and who allowed the British political, economic, and colonial system to continue evolving in the way it had been for decades, resulting in a growing commercial system and a constitutional monarchy that was beginning to resemble a modern parliamentary democracy. George might not have been a great monarch, but he was an ideal monarch to establish the Hanoverian dynasty and put Britain on the path to becoming the world's preeminent superpower in the 19th century. What do you think of King George I? Was he, in many ways, Britain's most underappreciated monarch who, in his own uncontroversial way, steadied the British ship of state during the Hanoverian succession, and then paved the way for Britain's rapid imperial expansion in the 18th and 19th centuries? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.